Chapter 1. Violet sat staring off into space as her maid fixed her hair into a trendy style. She cared little for how she looked usually, but tonight was a first for her. She was about to attend the premiere showing of her art. She'd sold many pieces over the years, but she hadn't done any real art shows. Seattle's first gallery had just opened, and her work was going to be featured in the initial showing. She was excited, nervous, and happy all wrapped into one. Ouch. Please don't twist my hair so hard, Margaret. I'm sorry, miss, but this is the style your mother said would be just right for your showing. Margaret had been Violet's personal maid for years. Well, she'd been the personal maid she'd shared with her sisters for years, but now that she was the only Sullivan girl left at home, she was just her maid. Well, we'd better listen to Mama then. You know how she gets. Violet rolled her eyes as she thought about her mother. She was a sweet woman, but her life goal was to see all 8 of her daughters happily married. Mama would harp on them to keep their hair fixed perfectly so they could catch the perfect man. She couldn't understand when one of her daughters wanted something from life other than marriage. She'd accomplished her goal with the first 6. Hyacinth had been married for over 3 years and already had a baby with another on the way. She and Iris were the only 2 left, and both of them had chosen to have careers instead of families. Since Violet was a little girl, she'd loved to paint. She'd started by doing portraits of her family and friends, but currently landscapes were her passion. In fact, the show she was about to attend would feature mostly landscapes and one other painting. The other painting was a surprise even for the manager of the gallery, but Violet knew without a doubt in her mind that it was her best work. She couldn't wait to unveil it for everyone at the show. She glanced at the corner of her bedroom where the painting was draped and leaning against the wall. Even her parents hadn't seen it yet, and usually she wasn't shy about showing them what she'd done. This one was special though. She really couldn't put her finger on why it was so important to her, but she knew it was the single most important thing she'd ever painted. It would change her life. She just didn't know how yet. I'm so glad all my sisters will be here for the show, Violet said enthusiastically. It had been years since all the Sullivan sisters were together. The last time had been when Daisy had traveled home to visit and Jasmine had been sent back to Montana with her. Daisy and Jasmine hadn't since coordinated a trip home at the same time, so even though they'd each traveled home with their families, they hadn't done so together. Your mama is beside herself. She has a photographer lined up to take a family portrait tomorrow. Even your brother-in-law's made it this trip. And all the grandchildren. There are so many grandchildren, even I'm surprised to see them all. How many does Rose have now? Violet smiled thinking of her nieces and nephews. Just 4. And Lily has 5. Amaryllis has 3. Daisy has 2. Jasmine has 3, including the 2 she got through marriage. And Hyacinth has 1 with another on the way. 18 grandchildren currently. You'd think that would be enough even for Mama. But it wasn't. There would never be enough. Margaret stuck the last pin in Violet's hair and patted her shoulder. She loves you and wants you to be happy. Oh, I know that, but sometimes my idea of happy is different than my mama's idea of happy. I wish I knew how we could both be happy. If only her mother could understand that every woman didn't have a life goal of marrying and having babies. Why couldn't her career as an artist be enough to make her feel fulfilled and happy? Why did she need a man? Oh, the only way for that to happen is for you to find a husband who will give you lots of babies while you keep your career. 2 of your older sisters are married with careers. It could happen. Violet sighed. It could, but I think Alex and Lawrence are rare gentlemen to not mind their wives working. It was definitely not a common thing for women to work and have families at the same time. She wanted it, but her career was too important to her to compromise. If she could only choose one, painting would win out every time. Well, then you just have to please yourself and stop worrying about your mama. Margaret pointed at the mirror. Do you like it? Violet studied her hair and shrugged. It's fine. Thank you, Margaret. She bounded out of her seat and stood still while Margaret helped her dress. Her corset was pulled tighter than usual to fit the tiny waisted green dress that she and her mother had ordered for the showing. When she was completely ready, Violet stared at herself in the mirror for a moment. She wasn't a vain woman, but she knew that night she looked her best. Her long honey blonde hair was swept atop her head in a tight knot. Her eyes matched the forest green dress exactly and looked huge in her face. She may pale beside her sisters, but tonight she would be the one shining. Jonas Smith shrugged into his suit coat and straightened his tie. He knew he was needed at the gallery for the first real showing, but he was still grieving. How would he ever learn to cope with his nephew when all either of them really wanted was for things to go back to the way they were? He wasn't ready to be a father to a child who wasn't even his, and his nephew certainly wasn't ready to lose his parents and have to go live with his uncle. Nathan would be staying with his nanny that evening while Jonas worked, and he'd begged his uncle not to go. If Jonas could have found any way around it, he would stay with the boy, but he'd committed to it. As the gallery owner, he needed to make sure he attended the events and didn't leave everything for his overworked manager. He would stay as short a time as he could possibly stay without being rude to the artist or the guests and get back home to Nathan. Every time they were apart, the boy was afraid. His parents had been murdered by someone who had stolen his mother's jewelry late one night in New York City just 3 months before, so Jonas understood the fear. He hated it, but he did understand. Once he was ready, he went into the nursery to find the small boy eating his supper. When he saw his uncle, his eyes filled with tears. "Hurry home, Uncle Jonas." Jonas wanted to cry himself as he knelt down and hugged the boy. "I will. I wish I didn't have to go. I'll come and see you as soon as I get home. All right?" Would he ever be able to stop feeling guilty that he was still alive while the boy's parents were gone? He hoped so. Nathan nodded. "I'll wait for you." His eyes were too old for a 3-year-old. Jonas wished he could wipe all the bad memories from the boy's mind, and they could start fresh. He kissed the top of his head and got to his feet. "I'll be back soon." Violet arrived at the gallery 15 minutes before the show began as she'd been told. Under one arm she carried the portrait she'd just finished. The painting that she knew was the best thing she'd ever done. It was carefully covered with a white sheet. "I need the best place to put this, Mr. Allen." "What exactly is that, Miss Sullivan?" "I wasn't aware there were any paintings we were waiting on for this show." The confusion on his face was obvious, but she knew he wouldn't argue too much. Her work was too good for him to refuse to show something she'd done. Violet smiled. "This is the best painting I've ever done, and I intended to have a place of honor in this show. Once everyone is here, I'll unveil it and let everyone see it." She walked to the middle of the largest room and nodded. "I would like an easel to be set up right here, so I can display it properly." It had to be the center of attention. Mr. Allen eyed her for a moment before shrugging. He'd obviously worked with enough artists to know better than to fight her on it. Once the painting was set just like she wanted it, she nodded. "That will be perfect." "Thank you." She turned as she heard the door open behind her and smiled as her mother and father hurried into the room. "You rushed off without us," Mary complained. "Why didn't you wait for us to be ready?" Violet made a face. "I told you I needed to be here 15 minutes early, and you weren't ready. You taught me to be punctual. Besides, at 20, I don't exactly need you to go everywhere with me, Mama." She leaned down to kiss her mother's cheek to lessen the blow of her words. She knew her mother would keep her under lock and key if she were able to. Arthur smiled and kissed Violet's cheek. "You look beautiful. I don't know why I'm not beating the men off with a stick over you." Violet smiled. "I chased them off well enough on my own." She winked at her father, knowing he would understand that she was teasing him just to annoy her mother. Mary sighed. "You could at least let us meet some of your gentleman friends. There may be one who is well suited to marrying you." "I'm not ready to marry and give up my career just yet, Mama." Violet knew she'd never be ready to give up her career, but she didn't say that to her mother. Her first showing at a real art gallery was not the time and place for that argument. They'd already fought it repeatedly anyway. She doubted if either of them had come up with a new argument since they'd last discussed it the day before. Violet's eyes were drawn to the door as it was thrown open, and a young woman with curly blonde hair that was down around her shoulders hurried into the room. Iris. Violet hurried forward and hugged her younger sister. Iris was the only Sullivan daughter younger than her, and she'd always had a soft spot for Iris. "Oh, I wasn't sure I'd make it on time," Iris complained. "I had an exam this afternoon, and it was just awful. I don't know why I'm expected to read Shakespeare when I'm going to be a doctor. I can just see myself quoting Macbeth as I mix up some medicine for a patient. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble." She wrinkled her nose. "If I never have to read another word penned by Shakespeare, it will be much too soon." "Oh, Iris, Shakespeare's not that bad. I read him for fun." Amaryllis had walked in to hear the end of Iris's tirade on the bard, and she'd leapt to his defense as usual. "Fine, really. From now on, you take my English exams, and I'll concentrate on the real subjects." Iris had never been able to understand why studying literature would help her to be a better doctor. She was fed up with having to study subjects that made no sense to her career. "I can't believe you complain about going to college. None of the rest of us were given a formal education." Amaryllis glared at her mother. "For the rest of us, college was too unladylike." Mary sighed. "Are we going to go over this again, Amaryllis? You could have gone to college if you'd had a real purpose in mind. You didn't. You just wanted to read a lot of books. You were perfectly well suited to be a librarian." One by one the Sullivan sisters arrived, and then slowly, the gallery filled with strangers. Violet was thrilled to see everyone enjoying her paintings. Once she felt like there were enough people there, she walked to her newest painting and put her hand on the sheet covering it. "This painting wasn't meant to be part of this show, but when it was finished, I knew it was my best work to date. I couldn't possibly keep it at home. I give you, Lost Souls." She pulled the sheet off the painting dramatically and was thrilled to hear the gasps from the people closest to her. Even Mary stood for a moment in silence staring at the painting that was filled with such raw emotion. "Who are they?" she asked. Violet shook her head. "I was in the park one day recently, sketching different things I saw. You know I go to the park with my sketchbook at least twice a week. Anyway, on that particular day, I saw these two just standing looking at one another. They both looked so sad, I had to sketch them." The painting featured a man who was probably close to 30 along with a young boy, not much over 4. They were looking at one another, and the emotion on their faces was enough to make anyone cry. As Violet looked around her, she could see several of the ladies in the room carefully dabbing at the corners of their eyes with handkerchiefs. Iris sighed. "I want to hug them both and do everything I can to make them feel better." Violet nodded. "That's how I felt when I saw them. I wish I knew who they were." The pair had haunted her since she'd first seen them in the park. "I can help you with that, Miss Sullivan," Mr. Allen said from directly behind her. "I'd like you to meet the owner of the gallery, Mr. Jonas Smith." His voice sounded apprehensive. Violet turned and saw the man from her painting glaring at her with something akin to hatred in his eyes. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Smith." Why was he angry with her? She'd taken his sadness and made something beautiful of it. "I'd like a word alone, Miss Sullivan." He didn't wait for a response as he strode quickly toward the office that Mr. Allen used during the day. Violet exchanged looks with her mother before following the man, feeling as if she were a schoolgirl about to be chastised for bad behavior. She stepped into the office with him and closed the door behind her, assuming that was what he wanted. "I'm sorry if that painting upset you, Mr. Smith." She had no idea why it would have, but she didn't want him to be angry with her. She needed to have a good working relationship with this man. "Upset me? You took my grief over my sister's death and exploited it so you could make money off of it." "I'm more than upset, I'm absolutely livid." Violet stared at the man in front of her. He had dark hair and eyes that were still very sad. "Your sister?" She didn't even know his sister. "Yes, my sister. She was murdered a few months back, and I'm now raising my nephew on my own." Do you have any idea what it's like to raise a small child by yourself, Miss Sullivan? Violet shook her head. No, sir, I don't. I know very little other than painting. I saw you and your nephew, and I just had to paint you. You had to see how everyone reacted to the painting. It's my best work, she told him proudly. He'd make money off of it as well, since he was the owner of the gallery. How could he fault her for that? My grief is your best work. I'm so happy for you. We'll finish out this show, but I promise you I will do everything I can to make certain you never have another show from me or any other gallery owner. I cannot believe you displayed my grief for the entire world to see. That was a private moment between my nephew and me. Violet sighed. Did you ever consider that private moments should be kept private? You were in a public park where anyone could see you. I did nothing you hadn't already done. She couldn't believe the nerve of this man. He'd accused her of doing something he had already done on his own. Good night, Mr. Smith. She left the room, slamming the door behind her. She knew it was petty and childish to do so, but he had just told her that her first big break into the art world would not be a success because he no longer wanted to work with her. If she were in a city like New York it would be different, but in Seattle, there was only one art gallery she could work with, and she'd just been told she'd never work with them again. When she walked into the main room, she could still hear the buzz of excitement over the new painting. Whatever Mr. Smith said, she'd done a good job with this one, and she wasn't going to be ashamed. She would enjoy her night, and she would sell paintings. She was an artist, and she was proud of her work. Mary looked at Violet with worry in her eyes. What did he say to you? She whispered. He's angry that I painted a private moment he had with his nephew without his permission. If the moment was so private, why was he having it in a public park? Violet sighed and turned as someone came up to her to get her attention again. All through the evening, Violet watched her babies leave in the hands of their new owners. There were only a few paintings left at the end of the night, one of them being Lost Souls. She was surprised that one didn't sell, but pleased she wouldn't have to give it up. Once everyone else was gone, Mr. Allen approached her. Miss Sullivan, you were a success beyond our wildest imaginings. I still cannot believe you sold so many paintings in just one evening. I would love to see what you could do with a showing in a gallery in New York City. Violet shook her head sadly. I'm afraid Mr. Smith said he'd never work with me again. He wasn't pleased with the painting of him with his nephew. She still couldn't believe the man had been so angry with her. She'd done nothing wrong. Why couldn't he see that? Mr. Allen frowned. I'm not terribly surprised. I'll talk to him. I don't think he understood the sheer magnitude of money you made us this evening. Violet smiled. Money wasn't terribly important to her, because her family had been wealthy for as long as she could remember. She did like the idea of earning her own money, though. It made her feel as if she'd accomplished something. I hate the idea of never again working with the only gallery in town. Please talk to him. If I'd known the man I painted was the owner of the gallery, I'd never have brought the painting. She didn't add that she never would have painted it, because she knew that nothing could have kept her from painting Mr. Smith and his nephew. Once she'd seen them, she had to paint them. It was as simple as that. Violet was still practically floating as she walked down to breakfast the following morning. She couldn't believe what a wonderfully successful evening she'd had. Good morning, Mama. She looked around. Where are the others? Did Iris already go back to school? Iris was up before I was this morning, and yes, she's back at school. She said something about having to spend as much time as she could this weekend studying for a big examination. Mary watched her daughter closely as she fixed her plate from the sideboard and sank into the chair opposite her. I'm glad we have some time alone. Violet always hated hearing her mother say those words. They either meant she'd done something to displease her mother or Mary wanted her to go shopping with her. She hated shopping unless it was for new art supplies. Her mother always wanted to dress shop, though. She kept silent and started on her eggs, hoping her mother wouldn't elaborate on what she needed her for. You're not going to get me to keep quiet by not saying anything, Violet. Mary glared at her daughter. Painting that man and his nephew was an invasion of privacy. Violet looked at her mother with surprise. But they were in public. How did they expect things to be private? That makes no sense to me. So if you were in public, say at the funeral of someone you love, would it be all right for someone to sketch you while you were mourning? Or to take a photograph of you? Violet thought about that for a moment. Of course not, but I wasn't at a funeral. I was in a park. Surely her mother could see the difference. Maybe you need to start thinking about the people you paint before you begin a project. For instance, think about what must have been going through that man's mind as he looked down at the boy. He may have just lost his wife. Whatever happened, he was eaten up with grief, and you captured it for the entire world to see. Mary shook her head. I just don't think that was very sensitive of you. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. They drew me, the man and boy who were so sad. I had to paint them. I guess I could have kept the painting to myself and not shown it, but what good would that have done? Art was for the entire world to see. Not just her. She couldn't not share her gifts. It would have done a lot of good for them. You don't understand the anguish of losing someone you love. Mary sighed. I don't know if you know this, but I had a miscarriage when Iris was about a year old. I was devastated. I cried on and off for months, and even now, I still mourn on the anniversary of the baby's death. Violet looked at her mother in surprise. I had no idea. The baby wasn't even someone you knew. I know. Think of how much harder it would be to lose someone you know and love. I loved that baby, because I love you girls and knew she would be another beautiful child. If I were to lose one of you or anyone else I love, I would be devastated. I cannot imagine losing your Uncle Max. And I memorialized his grief in a painting and then showed it to all of Seattle. No wonder he's angry with me. Violet looked at her half-eaten breakfast and sighed. I need to go to his house and apologize, don't I? Mary shook her head. As an unmarried lady, you shouldn't go to his house. You know that. You may send him a note and invite him here so you can talk to him if you'd like. Violet frowned. He's not exactly husband material, Mama. He's a very angry man with a small child to raise. It shouldn't matter if I go to his house on my own. Her mother's ideas of propriety made her crazy at times. What did her reputation matter if she was just going to have a career anyway? You know better than that, Violet. Or you would if you'd come down out of your room for more than 20 minutes per day. Your reputation will be in tatters if you're seen alone with him. Send him a note inviting him here so you can talk to him privately. I'll allow you to shut the door instead of leaving it open, so your conversation can be private. Violet nodded obediently. Yes, Mama. I'll send it over with one of the maids right after breakfast. I'm glad you see it my way. Of course I do. I don't want to, but I do. Violet ate the rest of her breakfast in silence, rehearsing what she'd say to Mr. Smith in her head the whole while. Chapter 2. Violet was heading to her father's office to write the note to Mr. Smith when she heard a knock on the door. She went to it and flung it wide, not really caring who was there. Her mother had spent years telling them to let the servants get the door, but she had never listened. Her mother wanted to live a life of formality that would have been good back east, but just didn't make a lot of sense in Seattle. Sometimes she found perverse pleasure in doing exactly what her mother said not to do. She stopped short when she saw who was on the other side. Oh, Mr. Smith, I was just going to pen you a note. Please, come in. She held the door wide and once he was inside led him to her father's office, closing the door behind them. Walking around the desk, she sat in her father's chair and left him to take the seat across from the desk. Please, have a seat. Violet hated being wrong, but more than that, she hated hurting others. She could recognize that she'd done both, and she would rectify the way she'd treated Mr. Smith immediately. Jonas took the seat she indicated. You were about to send me a note, he asked, seemingly surprised. His eyes were narrowed as if he expected her to say or do something stupid. Violet nodded. Yes. I want to apologize for my behavior, you see. I've never lost someone I love. I was insensitive to you and your nephew, and I never should have displayed that painting for all of Seattle to see. Will you forgive me? She could never go so far as to say that she shouldn't have painted it, because she knew deep down in her soul there was nothing else she could have done. Jonas blinked a couple of times in surprise. The last thing he'd expected was an apology. I didn't come to get an apology from you. I wanted to talk about working with you further. Your show did so well, it wouldn't make sense for me not to continue working with you. I know I was rude to you last night, but as long as you understand that that sort of thing will never happen again, we can work together. He closed his eyes for a moment, wanting her to tell him no, he didn't have any desire to ever see the woman again, let alone have a working relationship with her. Violet sighed. I'd be shooting myself in the foot if I wasn't willing to work with you. I do wish you would accept my apology. I never meant to hurt you or anyone else with that painting. I should have been more sensitive. She'd never had anyone not accept a pretty apology immediately. Why wouldn't he? If you were willing to work with me, I'd like to talk about a showing at my gallery in New York City. New York City? I've always wanted to have a showing there. It's been my dream since I was a little girl. Violet was surprised by how very excited she was at the prospect of working with this man. The previous night, she'd thought him old and crotchety. Now, she found him handsome and extremely attractive. Of course now he wasn't angry with her. At least she hoped he wasn't. Jonas nodded. I can get everything set up from here, but for the actual event, we will need to take a train to New York. Will your mother allow you to travel without her? He'd known very few young ladies who were allowed to travel without at least a traveling companion. He sincerely hoped he wouldn't have to put up with an overbearing mother on the 13-day trip as well as a spoiled artist. Violet thought about his question for a moment. She couldn't help but smile as she thought about how her mother had taken a train along with her sister Daisy when she left to go to Montana to be a mail-order bride. I'm honestly not sure. I hope so. She may insist upon going with us. Jonas raised an eyebrow. Will she make it difficult for me if she does have to go with us? There's no telling with Mama. Violet smiled at him. When my sister Daisy was my age, my mother went with her to be a mail-order bride in Montana. She tried not to laugh at the look of surprise on his face. What kind of mail-order bride took her mother along for the ride? Jonas sighed. I was afraid it would be like that. Would she be all right if I hired a companion to travel with us? I'd like to take my nephew as well, along with his nurse, of course. Violet thought about that for a moment. I think if she had some say in who you hired, Mama would be all right with that. She hoped that her Mama would have very little say in whomever was hired though. I would be happy to sit in on any interview. Then by all means I will run whoever I hire through your Mama. He stood up and walked toward the door, seeming to ignore her offer to help him interview companions. She could hear him mumbling under his breath about artists who were too young to make their own decisions. Once he'd gone through the door behind him, Violet stood up and did a little dance. Never in her life had she imagined that she really would be going to New York City and having a showing when she was only 20 years old. Did life get better than this? Violet wasn't at all surprised by her mother's reaction to her news. You cannot go across the country on a train with an unmarried man. You cannot go across the country on a train with a married man. Unless you happen to be married to him, it's not happening. Mary's face was set, and Violet knew better than to argue with her, but that had never stopped her before. Mama, it's just a business arrangement. He doesn't even like me. Even as Violet said the words, she wished they weren't true. What was it about the brooding man that intrigued her so? You are a beautiful girl, Violet. I don't think you have any idea what runs through a man's mind when he sees a girl like you. If you really want to go, I'll go with you. Mary's tone of voice made it very clear she was not going to accept any arguments. What if he hires a professional companion? Someone who will travel with us along with his nephew? She said a silent prayer her mother would agree with the plan. I would need to meet her first. If you feel that strongly about going, and I like the companion, I would consider it. Violet shook her head. You do realize I'm 20 years old, right, Mama? I don't need you to hold my hand and walk me to school any longer. How long would it take for her mother to realize that all 8 of her daughters were now grown? I do realize that. What I don't think you realize is that big girls have more to worry about from men. I'll tell him my mama says I have to have a nanny then. Even though it was the answer she'd expected, Violet found herself very annoyed by her mother's reaction. Secretly, she wondered if she just wanted to have time alone with Jonas Smith. She's never been attracted to a man before, and he definitely made her heart beat faster. Violet tried talking to her father when he got home from work that afternoon. "Papa, I just don't think Mama understands that this is good for my career." She tried to keep her voice calm and professional even though she felt like whining about the situation. Fred had listened to her rant and rave for over 10 minutes. "I happen to agree with your mother on this one. I know you were hoping that I would take your side, but I just can't do it. I love you, Violet, and I could never let you go off across the country with a man I don't know. Even if I didn't know him and you were married to him, I couldn't let you do it. I love you too much to put you in that kind of position. I thought you understood that I was a woman, Papa. You let Daisy be a mail-order bride." It was her ace in the hole, and she prayed her father didn't have an answer to it. "But I certainly didn't stop your mother from going with her. Jasmine and your mother both accompanied Daisy when she went to Montana. If you had a younger sister who wasn't in school, I would send her with you and be just fine with it. The problem is, you're the youngest still at home. I have no one I can send with you to keep you safe." As if Jasmine ever kept anyone safe. "I really expected more from you, Papa." Violet stood up and left the room, going straight up the stairs to her bedroom. Her sisters would be arriving any moment with their families so they could all have a family portrait taken. She never felt less like having her portrait taken in her life. She'd do it though. She wouldn't let her mother accuse her of sulking and say that she'd proved her point. The family had a huge dinner together after the photographer left. Even with as large as the Sullivan dining room was, there wasn't room for all of her brothers-in-law and nieces and nephews. Thankfully, it was a pretty September day, and they were able to set up tables on the back lawn. While they ate, Violet talked to Iris about how annoyed she was with her parents. "They let you go off to college and live in the dorm. Everything you want you're doing, but they still treat me like a baby." Since Iris was younger than Violet, she found the situation very unfair. "Oh, Violet. You were too busy painting to be there the day that I moved onto campus. Mama was right beside me, inspecting absolutely everything. Each girl we ran into in that dorm was asked the same 3 questions. What's the worst thing you've ever done? Why are you in school? Do you think you'll be a good influence on my daughter?" It was humiliating. Some of the girls still tease me about it, and we've all known each other for 2 years. True to form, Iris's arms were waving, and her fork was pointing in every direction as she spoke. Violet giggled. "I wish I could say I can't believe she did that, but I can see it happening. She's always been a little bit more overprotective than most of the mothers we know. They'd all rebelled against it in their own way. For a while, I was worried that she'd show up on campus every morning and walk me to class. At least she didn't do that." "Do you still enjoy the life of a college student?" "Not particularly. It's the only way I'll ever get to be a doctor, and I'll do just about anything to do that." Iris grinned. "Did I tell you that I got to help a local midwife with the birth of the baby? It was so exciting. You know, if you want to be a midwife, we have enough sisters to keep you in business forever." Violet smiled mischievously. She knew Iris had no desire to limit her practice to helping women give birth. She wanted to practice all forms of medicine, and she was determined to make it happen. Iris made a face. "Do you have any idea how many professors have suggested that I just be a midwife? It makes me absolutely crazy. Why can't anyone see a woman doing more than women's medicine? I don't want to spend the rest of my life helping women birth babies. I want to do something real." Violet frowned, realizing she'd gone too far. "I didn't mean to offend you, Iris. I think you're going to be the best doctor who ever lived. I know I'll be the first in line to get treatment from you. I promise, I will come to you if I'm having a baby." Iris gave a half laugh. I do want to deliver babies, I just don't want that to be all I do. Daisy walked over and squeezed between Iris and Violet. Mama tells me Mr. Smith wants to do a showing for you in New York City. That's so exciting. Are you going to do it? Daisy was the quietest and the sweetest of the 8 sisters. Violet had always wished she could be a bit more like Daisy. I want to, but Mama either wants to come with me or she wants me to have a traveling companion. I feel like she's forcing me to have a nanny. Do you ever think she's going to realize that all of her little girls are grown up now? Violet knew that Daisy of all of her sisters would understand her feelings. Daisy rolled her eyes. I do understand where Mama is coming from, but I also think she goes overboard. When I met Eli in Montana, he immediately grabbed me and started kissing me. You should have seen Mama's face. I thought she was going to call the sheriff on him right there and then. Violet giggled. Jasmine told us all when she got back. We all had a good laugh at your expense. She glanced over at Eli. He lived through the experience. Yes, he did. He wouldn't let Mama stay in our house that first time, even though there was plenty of room. I don't think she would have laughed if she hadn't been able to see me again after the wedding night. She was more than a little silly about that wedding. And look how that turned out. You and Eli seem so happy together. Jasmine even married someone from out there. How are she and Lee doing? Daisy smiled. They're doing really well after that rocky start they had. The boys just absolutely adore Jasmine. Someone has to, right? She winked at Violet. Jasmine had been a pain in the past, but she'd become a wonderful wife and mother. They were all proud of her. Violet giggled. They all made making fun of Jasmine their favorite pastime. She had been a terrible practical joker and her favorite victims were sisters. They all loved her now and they even liked her, but they didn't forget what she'd been like before. I'm so glad she ended up with twins just like her. Do they still play jokes on her at all? Never. Daisy shook her head. They're both afraid of what she would do back to them if they tried. Jasmine had been pranked by the boys just once, but it was enough for them to learn. Before they'd gone to bed that night, they'd realized who the mistress of practical jokes truly was, and they'd never messed with her again. So you think I should just get a traveling companion when I go to New York? That's what I'd do. Mama is right. Yes, she's been slightly overprotective, but I don't think you know the true dangers that are out there. You'll be much safer if you travel with a companion. If Mama can find someone young enough, you'll also have a lot of fun with her. I've heard New York City is a wonderful place, but it's so large. Yes, we all grew up in the city, but Seattle and New York are 2 totally different things. Violet made a face. Do you think Mr. Smith is attractive? Daisy's eyes widened. Are you finally noticing men? We thought it would never happen. Oh, stop. Last night he just seemed so angry that I didn't find him attractive at all, but today he seemed much nicer and more attractive. Daisy smiled. You definitely need a traveling companion. Do not let Mama go with you. If she does, you'll never have a chance for your relationship to grow. What relationship? There's nothing going on between us. I think he's still angry with me for painting that portrait. Nothing could ever happen between us. Violet wasn't even sure she wanted something to happen between. Besides, I'm married to my career. No man would ever allow me to spend as many hours painting as I do. Are you sure about that? I think Mr. Smith would understand in a way no one else ever would. He has a love of the arts as well. Violet considered her sister's words. You may be right. He's still too old for me though. Why, he must be almost 30. Daisy laughed. Maybe you should ask Mama how much older Papa is than she is. I sure wish one of my sisters could go with me. I know it can't happen though. I'll tell Mr. Smith to go ahead and start looking for a traveling companion. Mama says she'll have to meet anyone that goes with us. And his little nephew will go as well. I've never met the boy, but he's very cute. Daisy patted Violet's back. I think that's the right thing to do. Not only will it make Mama feel better, but it will be better for your reputation. I'll write him a letter as soon as everyone is gone then. Thank you for talking to me about it. The following day was Saturday, and the entire Sullivan clan gathered at Fred and Mary's house. The house was full of all 8 daughters, 6 sons-in-law, and gobs of grandchildren. Even Uncle Max, Aunt Harriet and their children dropped by. They played croquet in the garden, and Violet spent most of the afternoon sketching her nieces and nephews. She had spent a lot of time concentrating on landscapes in the past couple of years, and she found after doing the portrait of Jonas and Nathan, that she truly enjoyed working with people's faces. She had forgotten how much she liked doing it. By the end of the day, she had filled an entire sketchbook with the faces of those she loved, hoping that her next exhibit could be faces instead of landscapes. She'd been informed after the showing that the painting of Jonas and Nathan had sold, but she hadn't been told who had purchased it. She couldn't help but wonder if Jonas would be angry to know that the painting was out there somewhere and he couldn't get his hands on it. Once her sketchbook was full, she wandered back through the garden to her own special spot, the spot where her mother had planted violets after her birth. Once she was there, she sat down on the stone bench to gather her thoughts. She'd been sitting alone for about 20 minutes when she looked up and saw Rose and Lily headed toward her. She was always surprised to see her sisters together, because they were as different as night and day. Rose was as elegant as Lily was casual. Rose was always dressed in the latest fashion, and Lily usually wore a split skirt or even her husband's trousers. Her sisters came toward her and sat one on each side of her. Rose took Violet's hand and said, "I hear you're going to New York City. I would give anything to be able to go with you." "Well, anything but leaving my husband and children. I so want to shop there. I hear the dressmakers get patterns straight from Paris, and I can think of nothing more fun than spending my days having new dresses made all in the latest styles." Rose's face took on a dreamy look as she talked about her idea of a good day. Lily made a face. "I don't know why anyone would want to go to a city that big. Seattle is big enough. Where would you fish in a city that size? I mean, I know New York is on the ocean, but so is Seattle. I can fish in the ocean right here." She shook her head. "Fishing in ponds and lakes is so much more fun anyway." Violet sighed. "I just want to be able to show my work there. I can't imagine a place on earth that would be more wonderful for an artist. I've heard the architecture is something to be envied. Seattle doesn't have the rich history that New York does. I can't wait to go." Rose gave Violet a questioning look. "It doesn't make you nervous to go all the way across the country without family?" "Only a little. Mama will make sure I have a companion with me, and I'll have Mr. Smith and his nephew Nathan. I'm sure I'll be just fine. Hopefully I can meet some other artists while I'm there. I know it's strange, but I've never met anyone with the same vocation I have." She'd always felt a little lonely as a result, and it was hard to be lonely when you were always surrounded by people. Lily smiled. "I'm glad you're going and not me. I'd hate it there. You just have no sense of adventure, Lily." Rose shook her head at Lily as if she couldn't understand how the two of them could possibly be related. Violet looked up as she saw Amaryllis, Daisy, and Hyacinth headed toward them. Hyacinth's first book had just come out, and they were all so proud of her. Hyacinth's husband was a writer as well. He and Amaryllis had once courted for a short time, before Alex had come back from school. Amaryllis was the librarian for the Seattle Public Library. Alex hadn't liked her working at first, but he understood that she loved her job. Hyacinth and Amaryllis were the only women Violet knew who were able to have families as well as careers. She admired them both, although she wasn't sure she could do it herself. The 6 sisters sat and talked for over an hour before Mary sent Iris to find them. "So this is where you were?" Iris exclaimed. "Mama's been looking for all of you. You do realize that Jasmine's boys are doing their best to influence your children, right?" Her eyes were on Lily and Rose. Lily and Rose exchanged a look before jumping up and hurrying back toward the house. Iris laughed. "They're actually all napping." Violet laughed. "Everyone is so afraid of Jasmine and her boys." How much influence can 3 people have in just the short time that they're here? Aren't they leaving Monday? Iris nodded. And they just got here Wednesday. Lee couldn't be away from the ranch for that long. I think they're taking the same train as Daisy, Eli, and the kids. The sisters that were left in the garden all got to their feet and walked back toward the house. Did Mama really send you? Violet asked. Iris nodded. She did. She said that we are all together for a change, and she wants to see all of us, not just the ones who want to stay close to the house. Iris rolled her eyes. I've been trying to study for an exam. I was happy with the quiet. Violet smiled to herself. I really am glad everyone came out for my showing. I doubt I'll get everyone to go to New York with me. Amaryllis shook her head. You know as well as I do that's not happening. We all have jobs and families. We can't just run off to New York on a whim. She grinned at Violet. I'm so happy that you can though. Violet sighed. I know. It was just nice to have everyone together again. It doesn't happen nearly often enough. Amaryllis wrapped her arm around Violet's waist, resting her head on her friend's shoulder. No, it really doesn't. I wish our lives weren't so far apart. She gave Violet a serious look. I don't care how much you love New York, you have to come home to us. I can't have another sister move away from Seattle. Daisy smiled. I miss you too, really. Amaryllis sighed. I know you do. I think that's the only thing that keeps me from missing you more than I already do. Well, that and your weekly letters to me. Daisy and Amaryllis had always been close. Violet envied their relationship. She and Iris were close, but not in the way their sisters were. Iris and Violet were too different to be able to be too terribly close. When they reached the house, Violet was startled to see Jonas Smith there talking with her mother. She approached them, unsure what to say. Jonas turned and gave her a solemn look. I've got your New York showing set for 2 months from today. Can you have enough paintings ready by then? The look on his face told her that she really didn't have a choice in the matter. Violet thought about the paintings that were stacked along the walls in her room and nodded. Yes, I can be ready. I'll start interviewing women on Monday then. I've got an advertisement coming out in tomorrow's paper. He looked at Mary. You'll listen to my judgment in the matter of a traveling companion then? I don't want to go against your wishes. Mary nodded. I trust you, Mr. Smith. Knowing that you were the one who oversaw your sister while she courted changes things for me. I know you'll do the best you can for my Violet. Violet bit her lip. I'd really like to be part of the interview process. I'll be the one spending the most time with the woman after all. She wasn't certain either her mother or Mr. Smith would listen to her, but she really wanted to help with the decision-making process. Mr. Smith seemed to consider her words for a moment. That's fine. I'll give you my address. Come by my house around 10 in the morning, and we'll see who we like. He looked at Mary. I trust you find that acceptable? Mary shook her head slowly. As long as you promise not to be in a room with the door closed. I trust that you have servants who can chaperone you properly? Mr. Smith nodded. I'm not going to seduce your daughter, Mrs. Sullivan. We have a purely business arrangement. Mary gasped at his words. I don't appreciate your crudeness, Mr. Smith. I don't appreciate you treating me like a seducer of innocence, Mrs. Sullivan. He looked down at Violet, who was doing her best not to laugh. I'll see you at 10 sharp on Monday morning. I don't tolerate being kept waiting. I'll be there, Mr. Smith. I assure you, I don't keep people waiting. Violet watched him walk away, her eyes lingering on his strong shoulders through his white shirt. He'd left his jacket at home. He obviously didn't spend all his time behind a desk with shoulders that broad. Mary looked at Violet. I don't like seeing that look on your face when you're watching a man, Violet. You need to get your emotions under control. Violet blushed, not realizing her feelings had been all over her face. Yes, Mama. Chapter 3. After a cheerful goodbye to Jasmine, Daisy, and their families on Monday morning, Violet headed to Mr. Smith's house to participate in the interview process. When she arrived, she heard Nathan crying from inside the house. A young woman answered the door, looking flustered. "Is everything all right?" Violet asked. She looked beyond the young woman to Nathan, who was wailing. The girl shook her head. "We have a lot of days like this. Nathan misses his parents and isn't adjusting well." "I'm sorry to hear that. Maybe I could talk to him?" Violet was used to children, because she had so many nieces and nephews. She'd never been around a child who had lost his mother. The young brunette, who was obviously the boy's nanny, nodded. "I guess that would be all right. Who are you?" She looked confused, but willing to accept any help she could get. Violet laughed softly. "I guess I should introduce myself. I'm a local artist, and I'm here to see Mr. Smith. I'm about to have a showing at his gallery in New York City." "Oh, I see. I'm Hillary. I'm Nathan's nanny." She peered at Violet with obvious interest. "Are you the reason we're about to take a trip to New York?" "I guess I am. It's very nice to meet you, Hillary." Violet looked at the younger girl expectantly, hoping she'd introduce her to the boy. Nathan threw himself at Hillary. "I miss my mama." His face was filled with tears as he made his very important pronouncement. Hillary knelt down. "I know you do. I have a new person for you to meet. Won't that be nice?" She patted Nathan awkwardly as if she wasn't certain quite how to handle him. Nathan peeked around Hillary at Violet. "Who are you?" "I'm an artist. I'm here to see your uncle." Violet smiled at the boy. "It's very nice to meet you, Nathan." She held her hand out for him to shake, deciding at once he would prefer to be treated as a man. "I know." Violet did her best not to giggle. "Is it nice to meet me, too?" she asked. "I don't know. I don't know you yet." Nathan's voice sounded petulant. "Why'd you want to see Uncle Jonas?" "Well, we're going to find someone to go with us on a trip to New York today." She wondered how the boy would react to hearing her mention his home. "I want to go. I'm from New York." He wiped a hand across his tear-stained face, his voice going from sad to excited all at once. Violet smiled. "I know you are. I think you're going to go. We just need another grown-up to go with us." "Why?" "You know how your nanny does things with you? Well, I need someone to do things with me in the same way." She wasn't certain how to explain that her mother was worried about her traveling alone with his uncle without sounding like she didn't trust Mr. Smith. "You need a nanny?" Nathan's eyes were wide as he stared up at her. "Not exactly, but close enough." She reached down for his hand. "Do you want to show me where your uncle is?" Nathan took her hand and nodded. "He's in his study. He spends lots of time there. He's always writing letters." "Well, he's a busy man." Nathan nodded solemnly. "He is. Just like my papa was." Violet's heart went out to the boy. She wanted to tell him that everything would be fine, but how could it ever be fine for him with no parents? She couldn't imagine losing her parents now at 20. How could he possibly do without his at 3? "I'm sure you miss your papa." "Yes, ma'am. I do. But I miss my mama more." He looked at Violet with a smile. "It sure would help if my uncle got married." Violet looked at the boy in surprise. "Is your uncle courting someone?" It hadn't even occurred to her that the nice-looking Mr. Smith might have a woman he was interested in, and now that it had, she realized she hated the idea. She hoped he wasn't. She knew she didn't have a chance with him, but he was very handsome. "I don't think so." Nathan stopped in front of the door and pointed. "He's in there." Violet knocked softly. She wasn't sure if Jonas already had someone he was interviewing, or if he was waiting for her to start the first interview. She was a few minutes early, so she hoped she was in time. Jonas heard the knock on his door, and he took a deep breath. He wasn't certain if it was Violet, or if it was his first interview. He found himself hoping for some private time with Violet, but he immediately rejected the idea. They needed to be able to work well together, and she was much too young for him. "Come in." Violet walked into the room and looked around to see if any of the interviewees had arrived yet. When she saw that she was alone with Jonas, she left the door slightly open so they wouldn't be completely alone, just as her mother had taught her. She sat in one of the chairs opposite his desk and smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Smith." Jonas nodded at the young lady seated in front of him, struck immediately by how very pretty she was. He didn't want to like her, but after her apology on Saturday morning, he found himself at least a little drawn to her. "Good morning." He put down the paper he'd been reading. "I have 2 women coming for interviews today. The first is a Miss Henrietta March. The second is Miss Edna Blue. Do you know either of them?" He leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. He hoped she'd know enough about at least one of the women to help him with the decision-making process. "No, I don't. There are so many new people in Seattle every year, there's no way I could ever learn them all." Jonas leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms over his chest. "I guess I'm adding to the general confusion of the Seattle population." Violet smiled. "I guess you are, but you're definitely welcome here. I was so happy to see that there would be an art gallery here in town. I never thought I'd see the day. I'm very happy to be the one to bring it here. My sister, Emily Grace, and brother-in-law, Albert, planned to move to Seattle, and I came ahead of them. I wanted to get an idea of what it was like before they moved here. I had just enough time to buy the gallery when I received word of their deaths. I jumped on a train and immediately went to my nephew. We'd agreed before he was ever born that I would raise him if anything ever happened to them." He wasn't certain why he was telling her about the death of his sister and brother-in-law, but he felt compelled to share the information with her. "I'm so sorry." "How did they die?" Violet couldn't imagine losing people she loved. Death had never touched her or her family. Well, her grandparents had died, but she'd never really known them, so it hadn't seemed real to her. They went out to a play one night, and someone killed them so he could steal her jewels. His voice was raw with emotion as he spoke. "That's terrible. Poor Nathan. I can't imagine what he must be going through." Violet hated that the sweet little boy had lost his parents. "He has nightmares a lot. I feel really badly for him." He shook his head. He hated that one act of cruelty had changed so many lives forever. "If there's any way I can help him adjust to life in Seattle, just let me know. He seems like such a sweet boy." "Oh, he is. Thank you. We don't know many people here yet." He was surprised she was such a compassionate person. They'd started out on the wrong foot with the portrait she painted. He knew he needed to reassess and see what she was really like. "My plan is for the 3 of us plus whomever we hire and Nathan's nanny to travel by train to New York City, leaving in about a week." "Oh, that soon? I thought it would take longer to get everything ready." She loved the idea of leaving so quickly, though. She wouldn't have time to get nervous about leaving her family. "Do you not have enough paintings ready?" "We'll have a few weeks while we're getting ready for the show, so you'll have time to paint once we get there. We'll all stay at Emily Grace's house. I'll sell the house while we're there." He wasn't looking forward to the task of sorting through all her personal belongings and deciding what to keep and what to donate. The very idea of getting rid of some of her belongings made him feel weak with sadness. "You won't mind if I paint in her house? I have sketches to work from. I think I want the next showing to be all faces. Maybe call it Faces of Seattle. I promise, I have permission from everyone this time." She looked down for a moment in embarrassment. He eyed her for a moment, wondering if she was really the person he was seeing today or the spoiled brat who had refused to admit her wrongdoing on Thursday evening. He really liked the girl who was in front of him, but the other had been intolerable. Could she really have been so naive that she hadn't understood she was doing something wrong? A knock on the door stopped him from responding. His butler, Langsley, poked his head in. "There's a Miss March to see you, sir." "Thank you, Langsley. Please, show her in." A woman who looked to be in her mid-40s with spectacles perched at the end of her pointy nose walked into the room, looking down at the two of them. She took the seat beside Violet. Jonas smiled. "You must be Henrietta March." "Yes, sir. You may call me Miss March." Her voice was deep, and she seemed angry with the world. "All right, Miss March. Why do you want to be a ladies' traveling companion?" Miss March seemed to think about the question for a moment. "Truthfully, I'd rather not be, but I'm determined to have a chance to see New York City. It's my dream." She folded her hands tightly in her lap, her ankles crossed primly in front of her. Jonas blinked. Did she really just tell him she didn't want to work for him, and only wanted a free trip? "I see. Why do you feel like you're qualified to be a lady's companion?" "I'm a 46-year-old virgin. If I don't know the rules of propriety, no one does. In fact, I'll have you know that I've never even been kissed. I will be good at keeping any funny business from going on under my nose." Miss March's hair was pulled back into a severe bun at the nape of her neck. She looked as if she'd never smiled in her life. Violet shuddered at the thought of traveling across the country with this woman. She knew she would want to hide after 10 minutes of her dour presence. "Do you enjoy children, Miss March? We'll have a 4-year-old boy traveling with us." She said a silent prayer that her instincts were correct and the woman would hate the thought of being on a train for 2 weeks with a child. Miss March looked at Jonas sharply. "A child? You didn't put that in the advertisement. Nathan wouldn't be under your care, Miss March. Your entire task would be making certain Miss Sullivan was watched over and kept from doing anything improper." Jonas couldn't believe the woman's reaction to Nathan. Didn't all women love children? Miss March stood up abruptly. "I'm not willing to take that risk, Mr. Smith. Good day." She turned and left the room as quickly as she'd come. Violet waited a moment before bursting into laughter. She was a ray of sunshine, wasn't she? She'd had a schoolteacher like Miss March for a year, and she had no desire to ever spend time with someone like that again. Jonas simply stared at the door Miss March had closed behind her. "That was the strangest interview I have ever conducted." He looked at Violet. "How can you laugh? That woman was sour." His words made Violet laugh even harder. "I'm so glad she doesn't like children." Jonas's lips twitched. "I am too. I don't think I could have been on a train for 12 days with that woman." Violet shook her head. "I know I couldn't. I sure hope the other woman is better than her. What was her name again?" He looked down at the paper on his desk in front of him. "Edna Blue. She doesn't sound horrible. Maybe she'll be nice." He shrugged, catching her eye again. Violet's eyes were still twinkling as if she was stifling laughter. "She certainly couldn't be worse than that one." She nodded and giggled more. "I hope this one will work out, because trust me, neither of us want my mother going." He tilted his head to one side and studied her. "Why not?" "Oh, she's just crazy about propriety. She would be watching to make certain we never spoke in a tone she couldn't hear. She'd play matchmaker with us, trying to get us to marry. She's relentless." She made a face, hating the idea of her mother trying to force them together. He looked at her for a moment. "And would her playing matchmaker with us be so horrible?" Violet blushed. Did he think she was saying he wasn't good enough for her? Or that she thought he wanted to marry her? "Well, no, but I don't think either of us want to be forced to marry the other." "No, that's true." He leaned back again. "You surprise me, Violet Sullivan." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and she liked the sound of it on his lips. "Oh? Why is that? You seemed so unreasonable to me the night we met, and now I'm sitting here realizing that you're someone I could come to like a great deal. Not at all the woman I thought you were." "I hope that's a good thing." He smiled at her, liking her more by the minute. "It's definitely a good thing. I won't have to dread the time we'll spend together now." "You never knowed, I could make you dread it. One of my sisters was the best practical joker in all of Seattle." She wondered how he'd react to Jasmine and her pranks. If she tried hard, Violet was certain she could duplicate at least one of them. Really? How many sisters do you have? She grinned. No one from around here would ever ask that. I have 7 sisters. I'm the 7th sister of 8. His eyes widened. Any brothers? No. Isn't 7 sisters enough? I'm certain your father thinks so. That's a lot of responsibility. He shook his head. How many are married? 6. My younger sister is going to the university. She's going to be a doctor. A doctor? A female doctor? You don't mean a midwife? Violet grinned. No, she's going to be a doctor. So many of her professors are telling her it's impossible and that she'll never get into medical school. My money is on Iris. Iris? So she has a flower name too? How odd to have 2 girls named after flowers in the same family. We all have flower names. Rose is the oldest, and she married Sean, a dentist. Lily is next, and she married Daniel, a banker. Amaryllis is a librarian, married to a lawyer. Daisy and Jasmine live close to one another in Montana, and they're both married to ranchers. They had to leave to go back home this morning. She was sad that their visit was so short, but she knew they needed to leave. And then Hyacinth is 18 months older than me. She's married to Lawrence, and they're both writers. And then it's just me and Iris. I feel bad that there's no Petunia. Your mother missed some names. Violet shook her head with a laugh. I think she had enough flowers for a full garden, don't you? He sat back in his chair, trying to imagine what life would be like with 8 daughters. He couldn't imagine even one. That's an awful lot of flowers. You're probably right. You don't need more. He looked up at a knock on the door. Let's hope this one is nicer than the last. Come in. The last 2 words were spoken loudly. Langsley opened the door wide. There's a Miss Blue to see you, sir. Send her in. The woman that entered the room left them both speechless. Her hair was pure white, and she couldn't have been a day under 70. She practically bounced into the room and sat down beside Violet. I'm here to apply for the job of traveling companion. Violet looked at the other woman and immediately noticed the twinkle in her eyes behind her huge spectacles. Why do you want to be a traveling companion, Miss Blue? Oh, honey, you can call me Edna. I'm old. I think you can see that if you have eyes in your head, and you do appear to have eyes. I'm old, and I've been making hats for 50 years. Do you know what it's like to do the same thing day in and day out for 50 years? Of course you don't, you're young. She reached into the pocket of her dress and took out a silver flask, taking a deep swig of whatever was in it before tucking it back into her pocket. Well, now that I'm old, I realize that I haven't done some of the things I put on my list when I was a girl. She turned to Violet. Do you have a list? All of my friends and I, when we were very young, made lists of what we wanted to do before we died. I wanted to marry, and I almost did, but poor Harry died before we had a chance to reach that pinnacle of love that's expressed in a physical way. She shook her head. Anyway, on my list was to ride on a train and to see New York City. I've never been to a city of that size, and I'm going to do it or die trying. You're offering me a trip to New York, and I'm going to take it if you'll have me. She looked over at Jonas. So will you have me? Jonas blinked a few times, not sure he'd caught exactly what she was talking about, and what on earth was in her flask. Do you like children? Of course I like children. What kind of question is that? She looked at Violet. Are you with child? Is that why we're going to New York? If that's what it is, you can count on me not to tell a single soul. I'll either help you take care of it, or we'll find a nice family who will adopt it. Either way, my lips will be sworn to secrecy about your bastard child. Violet bit her lip to control her urge to giggle. I'm not having a bastard child, Miss Blue. I mean Edna, but I thank you for being willing to protect my reputation. I'd love to have you go with me. Suddenly she could see herself sitting beside this woman on a train bound for New York. She would be laughing the entire time. Jonas stared at the woman for a moment. The child is my nephew. He's 3, and he'll be traveling with us. While we're there, I need to pack up my sister's house and decide what to keep and what to donate. She died a few months ago. Oh, Mr. Smith. I'm so sorry for your loss. I'll be happy to help with your sister's child too. He's not a bastard, is he? She peered at Jonas expectantly as she waited for his answer. No, he's not a bastard. Does that matter? Oh no, sir. I love bastard children just as much as the regular legitimate tots. More probably. They need more love, don't you think? Jonas didn't feel at all qualified to answer her question about whether bastard children needed more love, and he still wanted to know what was in her flask. What's in the flask, Miss Blue? She pulled the container out of her pocket again and took another swig after unscrewing the lid. Oh, this? This is my cough tonic. She put it back in her pocket and looked at Jonas expectantly. Cough tonic? I haven't heard you cough even once. See? My tonic works. Would you like some? She pulled it out of her pocket to offer him a drink. Jonas held one hand up to refuse the tonic, but couldn't help but notice that Violet was giggling uncontrollably. Why Violet was turning violet, she was laughing so hard. No, thank you. He looked between the two women, wondering if Edna Blue was really the kind of woman they needed on their trip. After a moment, he shrugged. If you'll excuse us for a moment, I'll let you know our decision. Edna stood and went out into the hallway, not saying a word. Jonas heard her say, You must be the poor orphan nephew. We're going to be the best of friends. Would you like a peppermint? Yes, please, Nathan replied. Jonas turned to Violet wishing that Edna had closed the door behind her. Do you think that Edna would be a good companion for you? Violet grinned. Oh yes. She will keep me entertained when nothing else possibly could. Please, may we take her with us? Now that she'd met Edna, she wanted no one else to go on their trip with them. Edna was the only choice as far as she was concerned. Jonas sighed heavily. Do I have a choice? No, I don't believe you do. She was thrilled to have the option of taking the sweet old woman who was just a bit off her rocker with her. I love her, Mr. Smith. Jonas shook his head. I can see you do. All right. And please, call me Jonas. We're going to be spending a great deal of time together. There's no need to continue to be so formal. All at once, Violet was excited about the trip. Her mother wouldn't have to go, because they'd chosen a traveling companion. One that would be far more fun and exciting than any other companion she could imagine. She couldn't wait. All right, Jonas. I think Edna is the perfect solution to our dilemma. Jonas decided to hold his tongue over the kind of solution he thought Edna was. Miss Blue, he called out loudly. Edna popped back into the room, her frizzy white hair bobbing wildly. Yes? We'd like you to go to New York with us, if you're willing to accept the job. Jonas knew as soon as he said the words they were a mistake. He felt a huge sense of foreboding, but it was too late. He'd made the offer, and he was a man of his word. Edna immediately burst into tears. You're really going to take me with you? She dug into her pockets and finally, from between her very large bosom, she removed a handkerchief and blew her nose loudly. I'll be the best companion ever. You'll see. Violet looked at the older woman with a smile, patting her arm. I'm sure you will be. Jonas shook his head, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Edna was definitely not the type of woman he'd wanted to take with him to New York. She was going to be a handful. There was no doubt about it. Edna smiled radiantly at Violet, her face lighting up at the girl's words. I won't let you do anything you oughtn't do. I promise. She said the words as if she were taking an oath on a witness stand, and Violet barely suppressed another giggle. Edna jumped to her feet and waved. When do we leave? I need to pack my things. We'll leave 1 week from today. I'll send word after I buy the tickets about what time we'll need to go. Edna nodded. That will be wonderful. I will see you then. She rushed from the room, mumbling about all the things that she needed to do to be ready for the big adventure. Jonas watched her go and leaned back in his chair. Did that really just happen? Is that crazy woman going to New York with us? Violet smiled back at Jonas, happy that he'd chosen the woman she'd have chosen herself. She would have chosen Edna as a friend, not just as a traveling companion. She could see there was a great deal she could learn from the other woman. Most were things her mother would not be happy with her knowing, but she would learn them anyway. Monday couldn't come soon enough. Chapter 4. Violet was in her room packing everything she'd need for the long trip. She needed traveling clothes, but she needed formal clothes as well. She hoped her dresses were nice enough for a gallery in New York. They were fine for Seattle, but New York was a whole different world as far as she was concerned. She wished for the first time in her life that she had Rose's fashion sense. Her entire life she'd dreamed of going to New York to show her work, and for the first time the goal was within her grasp. She wanted to hug everyone she saw in celebration and had grabbed her mother and kissed her cheek when she'd returned home from Mr. Smith's house after the interviews. She'd told her mother how old Miss Edna Blue was, and her mother had smiled happily, saying she didn't need to interview her then. Violet was relieved, because she had a very strong feeling her mother would never approve of Edna. Violet looked up at the knock on her open door. "Do you need help?" Mary looked sadder than Violet had ever seen her as she stood in the doorway. "No, but I'd like it. What's wrong, Mama?" As much as her mother made her crazy, Violet hated seeing her look sad. Mary sighed. "I've spent that last 30 years raising you girls. You're the last to leave. I won't know what to do with myself with none of my girls left at home with me." Violet dropped the dress in her hands and hurried over to Mary to hug her tightly. "Oh, Mama, I'm going to miss you. You did such a good job raising us that we're all independent now. We're ready to move on. Besides, I'll be coming home. It's just a trip to New York." "A trip to New York where you plan to stay for 3 months, and it's a full month of travel. You'll be gone for 4 months. You'll come home, yes, but life will never be the same again. When you come home, you'll have grown in ways that neither of us can quite imagine right now, and I'll miss the young lady you are right now. Just like I miss the little girl you were. Well, we'll spend time together until then. I don't leave until Monday." Violet kept her voice bright, but inside she was crying. She had never been gone from home for more than a day or 2 at a time. "It's Friday, only 3 more days, and you'll be on a train and off to adventure." Violet smiled bravely as she picked up the dress she'd dropped a few minutes before, carefully folding it so it wouldn't wrinkle too much. "I'll be fine, you know. You would love Miss Blue. She's got to be at least 70, and she has always wanted to see New York. I can't wait to make the trip with her." She didn't add that the woman drank like no one she'd ever seen or that she seemed to be slightly batty, because her mother would only worry. She'd keep those little details to herself. Mary jumped in to help Violet pack, and it wasn't long before they were laughing about old memories. Violet looked up at another knock on the door and saw her Aunt Harriet standing there. "I thought I'd come see if you needed any help," Harriet explained as she ventured into the room. All of Harriet's children were off to school now, but she'd had 6 of them through the years she'd been in Seattle. "Why don't you just sit and talk to us while we work, Aunt Harriet? Mama and I have it under control." Harriet sank into the chair at the vanity and turned to watch the other 2 pack. She knew that Violet was just trying to keep her off her bum leg, as all the girls did. She didn't complain though. "I want you to know that I've investigated Mr. Smith." "Why?" Violet asked, doing her best to keep from blushing. Was it so obvious she was developing feelings for the man? "Well, you're traveling across the country on a train with him, so I knew it would make your mama feel better if she knew he wasn't a killer. Also, I thought if feelings developed between the 2 of you, you'd know you had my approval." Harriet had made a deal with their parents long ago when Rose had more suitors than she knew what to do with. She investigated every man her nieces were interested in to make certain they weren't making a mistake by marrying the wrong man. "Well, if it was to make Mama feel better, that's fine." Violet didn't meet her mother's eyes as she carefully packed another dress into her trunk. She'd already packed old patched dresses that would be used just for painting. Mary and Harriet exchanged a look that spoke volumes. You know that if you decide to marry, you need to come back here and plan a proper wedding. None of your sisters ever gave me enough time to plan anything. You will. Do you promise me? Violet shrugged. I really don't think you need to worry, Mama. I'm a career woman, remember? No man is going to want to marry a woman who spends all her time painting. They want a woman who will stay home and mind the children. Not all men, Harriet told her. Your Uncle Max doesn't mind that I own and help manage the battered women's shelter. Alex doesn't mind that Amaryllis works. Lawrence doesn't care that Hyacinth writes. Violet sighed. Those are really special men, Aunt Harriet. I'm not going to find a man like that. But oh, how she wished she could. She hated the idea of growing old alone. She wanted children just as much as the next woman, but she wasn't willing to give up her work to have them. She wanted it all, and she knew it just wasn't possible to have it all with most men. Did you know that Jonas's sister was an artist? That's why he opened the galleries. She wanted a place to show her work. Harriet watched her niece's face closely as she dropped that tidbit of information. Really? I had no idea. Violet was surprised her aunt was giving her the information, but even more surprised that it was true. Did that mean he'd be more open to a wife who worked? And did it really matter? He hadn't exactly told her he was interested in her. Really? She worked as an artist until the day she died. Harriet looked sad. You know that story, right? Violet nodded. His sister and brother-in-law were killed by someone who wanted her jewels. Yes, that's true, but they were killed by someone they knew. The man who killed them both invited them to go to the play with him, knowing she'd be wearing them. He's been sentenced to the electric chair. The electric chair? Really? I'd heard New York would use it. Has it been used successfully yet? Mary asked, surprised. New York City has been using it since 1890. They say it's more humane than hanging. Although why they'd want to treat a murderer humanely, I'll never know. Harriet shook her head. I did some research about it when I found out that he was going to be electrocuted. Violet shook her head. I can't imagine what he must be going through. He? Harriet asked. Nathan. Jonas's nephew. He's such a sweet little boy, and he lost both parents. I just want to hug him and keep him forever. Mary and Harriet exchanged a knowing look. Just make sure you come home and let me plan a real wedding before you marry him. I'm tired of you girls all getting married within a few weeks of getting engaged. Mary eyed Violet. Why don't we shop for a dress before you leave, and I'll work on planning the wedding while you're gone? Mama. That's ridiculous, we're not even courting. You can't plan a wedding. What would Jonas think if he found out her mother was planning a wedding for them when they'd never even kissed? Mary mumbled under her breath. None of your sisters were courting 6 months before their weddings. I need time. No. And please don't start behind my back either. I won't be part of it. Mary folded up a petticoat and dropped it into Violet's trunk. Fine. She looked at Harriet. I hope your daughters are better about giving you a wedding to plan than mine have been. Harriet covered her mouth with her hand. At least you have the satisfaction of knowing all of your daughters are happily married so far. She smiled at Violet. Just make sure you send a telegram before the wedding and not after. I don't think Mary could handle not finding out until after you're married. Violet shook her head and continued working, refusing to be a party to the conversation any longer. What was wrong with the two of them anyway? Mary wouldn't let Violet go to the train station on her own on Monday. Jonas had come with his buggy Monday morning so he could take her trunk to the station for her, so when it was time, she and Mary walked to the Seattle train station together. Mary had tears in her eyes as she turned to Violet. I'm going to miss you so much. Violet smiled against her mother's shoulder. I'm going to be fine. Miss Blue will be there with me, along with Jonas and Nathan and even Nathan's nanny. We're going to have a fine time. Jonas stepped up behind Mary and touched her shoulder. I'll take good care of her, Mrs. Sullivan. He could see by the older woman's face that she was worried about sending her daughter out in the world alone. Mary sniffled. I know you will. My sister-in-law had you investigated. She took the handkerchief that was offered to her, peering in confusion at the older woman standing with 4 more in her hands. Thank you. Jonas stiffened. Why did she have me investigated? Violet wanted to die. She wanted a giant hole in the ground to open up and suck her right down into it. Please don't let Mama tell him she thinks we'll be married. Please don't let her tell him. She's going to New York City with you. She'll be gone for 4 months. Of course you were investigated. Do you really think we'd allow our Violet to go off with a stranger otherwise? Mary's voice was indignant. I never thought of it that way, Mrs. Sullivan. He smiled down at the short, stocky woman. Thank you for allowing her to travel with me. I don't know if I would let my daughter go even if I had investigated the man thoroughly. Mary nodded regally. Now where's this Miss Blue? I'm right here. Edna said, waving 3 of the 4 handkerchiefs that were still in her hand. I'm ready to get on a train and go to New York. Mary blinked at the older woman for a moment, obviously having expected someone quite different from Edna Blue. She was wearing a yellow hat with a giant purple flower growing out of the top and a pink stuffed bird perched beside the flower. Her dress was brown with orange polka dots and looked hideous with the hat, but Edna stood there as proudly as if she were dressed in the latest of fashion. Mary offered her hand. It's nice to meet you, Miss Blue. Oh, please call me Edna. Everyone does. Edna stuck her hand into the front of her dress between her overlarge breasts and pulled out a peppermint stick, offering it to Mary. Would you like a peppermint? Mary shook her head slowly. No, thank you. Her eyes met Violet's with something akin to horror. Violet merely smiled. I'm so happy you'll be my traveling companion, Edna. She linked her arm through the older woman's. We'll be sharing a sleeping car. Mary looked as if she'd just been hit over the head. But, you said you had a sweet older woman as your traveling companion. That she'd take good care of you. Edna nodded and smiled at Violet. So nice of you to describe me that way. Looking at Mary, she smiled. I will take very good care of her. I almost married once myself. What happened? Mary asked, looking as if she were afraid of the answer. Violet could see the unspoken questions in her mother's eyes, and she wanted to laugh hysterically. Mary couldn't really complain about Violet's choice of a traveling companion without hurting the older woman's feelings, but she obviously had reservations. Oh, he had a heart condition. One day we were laying in the grass in the woods, and we were kissing and getting really close, if you know what I mean. Well, anyway, he died before we could make it happen. Tears sprang to her eyes, and she shook her head sadly. I know I'll never find another love like him. Violet coughed to keep a giggle from erupting. I'm so sorry he died that way, Edna. Had Edna really just told her mother that her fiancé had died trying to precipitate their marriage vows? Oh my. Mary blinked a few times before she found her voice. You aren't going to let my daughter have relations before marriage, are you? She sounded absolutely horrified by the idea. Edna seemed to consider the question carefully. I'll not allow her to do anything that would damage her reputation, she answered finally. Mary nodded as if she had gotten the answer she wanted, but Violet wasn't certain that she actually had. Did that mean Edna was all for premarital relations as long as there was no danger of being caught? If so, her mother would have a fit. Jonas stepped forward. The conductor is calling for everyone to board. We need to go. Oh, where's Nathan? Violet asked, looking around for the boy. His nanny has him over by the train. He wanted to see if he could put something on the track and see if the train would flatten it. Jonas smiled. He remembered doing the same exact thing as a boy. Violet nodded before turning to her mother. She hugged her tightly and whispered to her, I'll be just fine. You have nothing to worry about. She hoped her mother wouldn't change her mind at this late date. She wished Edna had taken just a bit longer to arrive. The longer Edna and Mary spent together, the less chance Violet had of being able to go to New York. Mary shook her head, obviously still concerned. Be on your best behavior. I don't know that I trust this traveling companion of yours. Her breath smells like whiskey. Violet suppressed a giggle. It's just her cough tonic, Mama. I'm a big girl. I'll be fine. Edna stepped forward and put her hand on Mary's arm. Don't worry, Mrs. Sanderson. I'll take good care of your baby. Sullivan, Mary corrected. Excuse me? Edna looked thoroughly confused. Our last name is Sullivan, Mary said with an exasperated sigh. Isn't that what I said? Jonas finally grabbed Violet's arm. We're going to miss our train. Good day, Mrs. Sullivan. Violet will be fine in our care. He pulled Violet toward the train, and Edna hurried along behind them, holding her hat firmly on her head. Mary watched them go with sadness and fear in equal parts on her face. What was going to happen to her daughter? Violet was a little surprised at just how cramped the quarters were in the sleeping car. She'd expected something like her bedroom at home that she'd grown up sharing with Iris, but this was much smaller. There were 2 bunks, and she put her things on the top bunk, wanting to spare Edna the climb at the end of the day. When she turned around, Edna had a sad look on her face. What's wrong? I thought you were excited about going to New York. Well, of course I am, but I wanted the top bunk. I'll be able to see ever so much more from it. And what could be more fun than climbing the ladder in my nightgown at the end of each day? Edna shrugged. I guess I'll take the bottom bunk. She looked like she was fighting back tears. Violet shook her head. Oh no, ma'am. If you want the top bunk, you take it. I thought I was leaving you the better bed. She reached up and pulled down her carpet bag, which had the things she'd need for the train ride. Her trunk was safely in the baggage car. Edna dropped her own bag to the floor and clasped her hands to her chest excitedly. You really don't mind? I would be so thankful to have the top. I don't mind at all. Violet sat down on the hard-bottom mattress, wondering how she was going to be able to sleep there for almost 2 weeks. She knew she had been pampered growing up, and she'd enjoyed that pampering. The hard mattress was going to give her fits. Violet threw her things onto the top bunk, looking around the room. There's not much room in here. Where will we spend time during the day? Edna looked perplexed for a moment, opening a door. What's in here? Violet peered over her shoulder and gasped. That's amazing. It was a room with a couch, low table, and 2 comfortable chairs. She pushed the door wider and walked into the room, looking around. Are we allowed to use this room? Her mother and sisters had talked about their train rides, and they'd always been on trains with hard benches as seats. This was nothing like anything she'd ever dreamed of. Violet walked across the room and tried another door. She opened it and saw little Nathan talking to his nanny, Hilary. They were obviously in their own sleeping chamber, which was very like Violet and Edna's. Upon seeing Violet, Nathan hurried over to her. We're going to New York. I'm going to show you my real house. You're going to love it. Violet smiled, crouching down to eye level with the boy. I can't wait to see it. She took Nathan's hand. Will you show me around New York City? I've never been, and I really don't want to get lost. Nathan looked at her with wide eyes, before nodding. I will. We'll even go to Central Park. It's like being in the country in the middle of the city. Violet made a face. Why not just move to the country then? She'd never understood people thinking they needed to live in the city but have a country life. It was so odd to her. 'Cause the country isn't New York. He took her hand and pulled her into his room. Miss Sullivan? Would you tell Hilary that I get to sleep on the top bunk? She says I'm too little and will fall out on my head and break my neck. I think I'll be safe. Tell her. Edna followed along behind them, looking up at the top bunk and down at the little boy. Good gravy, boy. If you fall off there, you will break your neck. No, I think you need to sleep on the bottom. She shook her head at him sadly. Nathan hung his head. But I want to sleep on the top bunk. It looks like ever so much fun. Edna fished into her cleavage for a peppermint stick. At the look of pure disgust on Hillary's face, Violet hid her smile behind her hand. Nathan took the sweet with a nod. Thank you. You're welcome. Maybe if you don't fall out of your bed and break your neck even once on the way to New York, you can sleep on the top bunk on the way back. Edna looked delighted at her solution to the problem. Nathan smiled and clapped his hand. What a wonderful idea. Hillary glared at Edna. I'd appreciate it if you don't put ideas in his head. He's my charge, not yours. You take care of Miss Sullivan. Seeing that Edna looked primed for a fight, Violet stepped between them. Please call me Violet. Miss Sullivan is so formal and we're going to be spending an awful lot of time together. Hillary nodded slowly. It doesn't seem proper, but I'll call you Violet. Thank you. Violet linked arms with Edna. Why don't we go see if we can find the dining car? I've never been in one, have you? She needed to separate the two before anything happened between them. They had barely gotten started on their trip. She wanted them all to be friends. As they started across to the dining car, Mr. Smith came out of a door across the hall. Ah, ladies. Have you found everything to your liking? Violet nodded. The accommodations are very nice. I wasn't aware there were trains this luxurious. She was thrilled, though. She was going to enjoy her trip if they were able to travel in this much splendor. He smiled. Only if you own your own train car. I knew I'd be traveling back and forth from Seattle to New York City a lot, so I went ahead and purchased one. I see no need to be uncomfortable for the entire trip. Violet looked at Edna, who looked as if she wanted to drop to his feet and kiss them. It's wonderful. Where's the dining car? We have our own chef here in our car. May I escort you ladies? Jonas badly wanted to impress Violet, but he wasn't certain why. She was pretty, yes, but he'd known prettier girls back in New York. What was it about her that tugged at his heartstrings? He led them to a small dining room where there was a long table laid out. He pulled Violet's chair out for her, before performing the same courtesy for Edna. Violet looked around her. But where's Nathan? Surely he'd be eating with them. Why would they be formal on the train? Jonas looked surprised for a moment. He'll eat with his nurse later. Violet shook her head vehemently. No, he needs to eat with us. How will he understand that you're really a family if he's not allowed to even eat meals with you? He raised an eyebrow. Did your parents allow you to eat meals with them when you were small? He'd seen the house she'd grown up in, and he knew that she had been raised with wealth. Surely she had been raised the same way he was, with children eating with their help while the adults dined alone. Of course they did. Mealtimes were always a bit chaotic in our home, especially with Jasmine there, but they were wonderful. It was the only time of day when the entire family gathered together and talked. Jonas thought about that for a moment. Well, I can let him eat with us if you feel that strongly about it. He'd never heard of such a thing, but he could easily see her point. Violet smiled happily. Please do. While they waited for him to return, Violet turned to Edna. We're traveling in far more luxury than I'd imagined. Edna nodded. I'll say we are. It's wonderful. She smiled happily. A moment later a waiter entered their dining room, bringing a large pot of soup. He carefully set it on the table, giving Edna an odd look. After he'd left, Edna leaned over and whispered to Violet. He was staring at my bosom. How dare he? Violet covered her mouth to stifle the giggle that threatened to bubble over. Of course he'd stare at Edna's bosom. She had 3 long peppermint sticks sticking out of the front of her dress. That's awful. You'd better cover yourself. She knew she should probably tell the older woman about the peppermint sticks, but it was so much more fun to play along with her. Edna quickly set herself to rights. She pulled a handkerchief out of each of her sleeves and used them to cover her chest above her dress. Then she pulled her dress down low around her ankles, making sure she was covered to the tops of her boots. There. Is that good? Violet studied her companion for a moment. Yes, I think you're sufficiently covered now. Edna nodded and carefully served them both a bowl of the rich potato soup. Jonas returned a moment later with both Nathan and Hilary. Nathan scrambled onto a chair beside Violet and smiled at her. Uncle Jonas said you wanted me to eat with you. I'm glad. Violet grinned down at him. Would you like a bowl of soup? Oh, yes, please. Jonas stood looking from his nephew, who looked happier than he'd seen him in months, and Edna. Why had she decided to wear her handkerchiefs? He was afraid to ask and took his seat at the head of the table, Hilary sitting across from Nathan. Violet carefully served the boy some soup, cautioning him to be careful. Don't burn your mouth on it. Yes, ma'am. Nathan picked up his spoonful of soup and blew on it obediently, trying to cool it. Violet's eyes met Jonas's, and the look on his face made her want to laugh all over again. He'd obviously noticed the handkerchiefs that were laid across Edna's chest and wondered about them. I sure would like to talk to you about the show later, she told him, planning to tell him of the entire conversation. When the waiter came back a few minutes later to remove the soup and bring the main course, the poor man's eyes all but bugged out of his head as he saw Edna's new attire. Edna glared at him for a moment, and then she quickly removed the handkerchiefs. I'm so sorry, kind sir. I should have realized that if you were looking at a woman as old as I am, you must be lonely. Here, she said as she set the handkerchiefs aside and unbuttoned her gown twice, showing a good bit of her wrinkled bosom. Now you can see it better. She leaned down and hiked up her dress to almost her knee. How's that? The man gaped at her in shock. Madam, I have no idea what you're doing, but I suggest you cover your dot peppermint sticks. Oh, you don't have to worry. I'm not angry that you were staring at my bosoms. Why, back in my day, I had the best bosoms around. Edna waved her spoon at the man while she spoke, causing him to stare at her with an appalled look. I was not staring at your bosoms. He looked at Jonas as if he wanted help from him. When Violet glanced over at Jonas, she saw that he had his napkin in his hand and was covering his mouth with it, obviously trying to conceal his laughter by wiping his mouth. How they'd ever survive Edna for 2 weeks on a train, she didn't know, but she certainly couldn't wait to find out. Chapter 5. After lunch, Jonas sought out Violet. You wanted to speak with me about the show? Violet nodded, looking over at Edna skeptically. Do you mind if I have a private conversation with Jonas? She knew it wasn't proper for her even to ask, and if Edna was serious about chaperoning them, she would immediately say no. Edna shook her head with a sly smile on her face. Of course not. You two run along and have fun. Violet wasn't sure what to make of that, but she was thankful for the time to talk to Jonas privately about what had occurred at lunch. She followed him into a room that he'd set up as an office, right there on the train. As soon as he'd closed the door behind them, Violet began to shake with laughter. As soon as he saw her face, he did the same. She sank into the chair in front of his desk, all but howling with mirth. He sat on the edge of his desk facing her. What happened that she became certain Maurice was staring at her bosoms? Violet wiped away a tear. She had 3 peppermint sticks poking out of her cleavage at an odd angle. He did a double take, which no one could blame him for, and she decided he was staring at her. I encouraged her to cover herself, and it went downhill from there. He shook his head, still laughing. I have a feeling, we shouldn't be encouraging Edna to do anything other than be a good companion to you. Violet grinned. Honestly, I'm not certain she's even going to be that. She didn't even question the 2 of us wanting a private meeting, and she didn't tell me to leave the door cracked or anything. Not that she was complaining. It was nice to not have to be as worried as she'd always been about how people would view something. She finally felt as if every move she made wasn't being watched. His face sobered after a moment. I saw the look on your mother's face when she met Edna. Do you think she's going to try and stop us? How could she stop us now? We're already out of Seattle. She's going to have to get used to the idea that I can handle myself. She frowned. She wouldn't be surprised if her mother got to New York a day or 2 after them to make certain she was being a proper lady. Jonas studied her for a moment. You're not worried about your reputation? Violet shrugged. I've never planned to marry. I'm too devoted to my career. What difference does it make if my reputation isn't lily white? Jonas sighed. You don't think a man could handle your career? He'd never thought it was a bad thing for a woman to have both a career and a family. Emily Grace had managed both beautifully. Well, two of my sisters have careers, but they're married to very special men. I've never known a man, other than the two of them and my uncle, who would put up with a woman working. I think it's an awful lot to ask. She'd never met a man who made her want to ask. Yes, I guess it is. He moved around behind his desk and sat down. What do you want to get out of our New York trip? Every conversation with her made him just a bit more attracted. He needed to focus on business while they were alone together. Violet thought about that for a moment. Well, I want to sell a lot of paintings, of course. Really, the money isn't all that important to me at this point, but I want people to see my work. I'm proud of what I've done. How could she explain that money wasn't an issue for her, but sharing her work was? Would anyone really understand that? You should be. You're very talented. She looked down at her hands for a moment. The painting I did of you and Nathan sold. I was hoping that I could buy it and either keep it or give it to you. I'm sorry. He blinked a moment over her change in subject before shaking his head. He'd purchased the painting to keep it from others, and he knew someday he'd be pleased to have it. You need to stop worrying about that. All is forgiven. Violet met his eyes. It is? Really? Jonas saw the look of utter relief on her face as she quietly questioned him and realized that he'd gone overboard in his reaction to her. He stood and walked around his desk and perched on the edge of it. Taking her hand, he pulled her to her feet, putting them at eye level for the first time. His superior height had always made her feel small, and Violet was startled at how odd it seemed to be able to look into his eyes directly. They were a deep brown, and she looked into them feeling as if she'd be lost in their depths. I really am sorry. He nodded. I know you are. It's fine. I think now that I'm in possession of the painting, things are in perspective for me again. Someday I'm going to be thrilled that I have it to remind me of my first days with my nephew. It was almost as if the painting would be there to commemorate his start with Nathan. Do you really feel that way? She asked. Did you purchase the painting? Relief washed through her at the idea that the painting was in his hands. She wanted no one else to have it. Yes, and yes. I don't hold it against you that you painted it. I wish it hadn't been the focal point of your showing, but I'm glad that I have it. He reached out and stroked a finger over her cheek, wondering how she'd react. Her skin looked so soft to him, and he couldn't stop that one brief movement. He knew he should, but he was so attracted to her. Without thinking, she turned her head and brushed his fingers with her lips, kissing them. She felt his touch all the way to her toes, a tingling starting in her belly. Jonas was startled for a moment by her brief kiss, wondering if she was feeling the same things for him that he felt for her. The initial attraction had grown every time they'd seen one another. Despite her words that she knew no man could ever deal with her career, he knew he could. Would that change her mind about a relationship? Violet felt the blush creeping up into her cheeks. He hadn't said anything about her kiss of his fingers, but he'd also not pulled away. Did that mean he didn't mind? I think maybe you should run back to Edna before I kiss you. She blinked for a moment. Do you want to kiss me? She'd been kissed by family members, but she'd never had a man take her into his arms. All at once, she wondered what she'd been missing. All her sisters were married, and they were happy. Could she possibly need more physical love in her life? Would she even enjoy a kiss? You're a beautiful woman. Of course I want to kiss you. His voice was low and gruff, his eyes never breaking contact with hers. Do you want to be kissed? Violet nodded slowly. I think I do. As long as it was by him. She'd never felt the slightest inclination to kiss a man before. He chuckled softly. You think you do? Maybe you should come back when you know you do. I don't want to do anything that would displease you. She tilted her head to the side for a moment considering. I do. Kiss me. She knew she was being bold, even forward. She didn't care. She wanted to find out what the big deal was about kissing a man, and she didn't want to wait another minute. I've never had a woman demand I kiss them before. Perhaps I won't be able to kiss you properly having you order me to do it. His voice was teasing, but he made no move to take her into his arms. Violet could see his eyes dancing with amusement. During the short time she'd known him, some of the intense grief seemed to have left his eyes, and other emotions seemed to be taking over. All at once, she knew she didn't want to leave the room without knowing what it was like to be kissed by this man. She took a quick step forward and placed her hands flat on his chest. Her movement put her between his spread legs, where he was sitting on the edge of his desk, but they were still on eye level with one another. He grinned at her. Well, it looks like you have me trapped now. His hands moved to hold her at the small of her waist, feeling her rigid corset through her dress. Will you have the courage to actually do anything about it? Violet had never even thought about being the one to initiate a kiss, but she didn't care. She'd been dared too many times in her youth to be able to resist. I think I will. She took one step closer, until her breasts were pressed against his chest. She wished he would take over, but if he didn't, she would at least know she'd kissed him. Gently, she pressed her lips against his, pursing them and making a slight smacking sound. Pulling away, she smiled at him. She'd done it. She'd kissed him. There. That wasn't a kiss. She frowned. It wasn't? What was it then? Well, it was a kiss, but that's the kind of kiss a child gives to her parents. Kiss me like a woman. Violet blinked a couple of times. She didn't want to admit she didn't know how to kiss any other way, but surely he already knew that. Show me, she whispered, pressing her lips against his again. Jonas felt all of the humor leave his body as she pressed herself close against him again. He moved his lips against hers gently for a moment, and then his tongue reached out to trace her lips. He cupped the back of her head and tilted it to the side to give him better access. Open your mouth for me, sweetheart. Violet was startled by the words. Why would he want her to open her mouth? People didn't kiss with their mouths open, did they? She obeyed tentatively, spreading her lips just a tiny bit. His tongue immediately demanded entrance, and she pulled back, startled. What are you doing? Showing you, he whispered back, pulling her close again, his tongue sweeping into her mouth, while one hand held her head still. His other hand roamed over her back. His hands roaming over her combined with his tongue toying with hers startled her for just a moment, and then she gripped his shoulders, pulling him even closer. One hand began to move up and down on his back as she tried to make him feel as good as she was feeling. After a moment, he pulled away, his breathing slightly faster than it had been. I need you to not get any better at that than you already are. Why? Did he feel the same kind of tingling in his belly that she'd been feeling? If so, how could he have pulled away when he did? She wanted to tell him to never let the tingling stop. I think I like kissing. He let out a quick bark of laughter. God help us all. We have the worst chaperone on the face of the earth, and you like kissing. This is not going to be good. How on earth was he going to be able to keep his hands off her? Why not? If I had a better companion, then we wouldn't have the opportunity to kiss. I think it's working out very well. She leaned toward him again and brushed his lips with hers. He put his hands on her shoulders and pushed her away from him gently. Things will go too far too fast if you keep that up. Go back to Edna. We'll talk more later. Violet stood looking at him for a moment, wondering what she'd done wrong. Finally she nodded and without another word left the room. Jonas watched her go, wondering what he'd just gotten himself into. He never mixed business with pleasure, and he never became involved with young virgins. He'd done both. Life was either about to get very interesting or absolutely terrifying. When Violet got back into the small room she shared with Edna, the older woman had put all of their things away, neatly hanging Violet's traveling clothes in the armoire in the corner of the room. She was sitting on the top bunk, her hat beside her. I like it up here, she called down to Violet. Violet smiled up at her, doing her best to keep her emotions from her face. Are you going to be able to get down from there? Oh, yes. I think so. Edna peered over the edge of the bed happily. Is Jonas a good kisser? Violet stared up at the older woman. I don't know, she answered honestly. She had no way to compare him to anyone else, so she really didn't know. He didn't kiss you? Your lips look swollen. Violet blushed, wondering at the older woman's frankness. Did she want her kissing Jonas? He did kiss me, but he's the only man who ever has, so how do I know if he's a good kisser? Edna got a faraway look in her eyes. Did he make your stomach tingle? Did you feel his kiss all the way to your toes? Did you want to keep kissing him forever? Violet gaped at Edna. That's exactly how I felt. How did you know? It was like the older woman could read her mind. Edna laughed softly. That's how my Harry made me feel. I may be old, but I sure do remember what it felt like to be held in a young man's strong arms and be kissed senseless. Did he kiss you senseless? Violet let out a little giggle. I think he did. But then he pushed me away. Do you think he doesn't like me? Oh, he's probably just trying to save your reputation. People worry too much about reputations and not enough about just living life. What did he say? Violet repeated Jonas's words about going too fast. I'm not sure exactly what he meant, though. She hated that she was so innocent. Hopefully this trip would take care of that for her. He meant he's worried that if he keeps kissing you, the two of you will end up fornicating. I think you should go for it. Fornicating? Violet had heard the word of course, but she didn't know exactly what it meant. She knew it was forbidden, though. Premarital relations, love. You do know what that means, right? Oh, yes, of course. She had a vague idea at least. Her sisters had talked enough that she wasn't totally in the dark. They all seemed to talk as if they enjoyed it. Before Violet had left, Hyacinth had talked to her about the mechanics of lovemaking, saying something vague like, just in case the two of you can't wait to come home to marry. Why did everyone assume she was going to marry Jonas? She barely knew him. Oh, good. I'd explain it to you, of course, but I couldn't answer questions well, because I've never really done it myself. I wanted to. I came close. Edna shook her head sadly. Poor Harry. Violet blushed. Yes, poor Harry. She sat down on her bed, tucking her feet under her, liking the idea of being able to talk without actually seeing Edna or the older woman seeing her blushes. Tell me about Harry. Oh, Harry was wonderful. He wasn't perfect, mind you. No man ever is, but Harry came close. I was in my 30s, and already a spinster when I met him. He was a lumberjack who worked for my father. He came to supper one night, and I thought he was the most handsome man alive. I've always been one who finds a man's muscles attractive. Violet stifled a giggle. She could just see the older woman ogling a young man with muscles. Did he ask you to court right away? She enjoyed hearing a good love story. Nothing so formal as that. He asked me to go for a walk with him after supper, and I did. My mama had died long before that, so I was keeping house for Papa and working as well. Well, I went out with him. I really wanted to kiss him, so when we were far enough from the house to be hidden, I stopped walking and kissed him. She sighed happily. It was my first kiss. I immediately felt as if my body was on fire. I wanted to drag him down into the leaves there on the ground and have my way with him right there and then. Harry was a gentleman though. He didn't even touch my breast until I'd known him for 2 weeks. I tried, though. You let him touch your breast? Violet tried not to sound scandalized by her companion's words, but she knew nice girls didn't let a man do that. She wasn't certain nice girls even did that after they married. Oh yes. I think that women need to take happiness where they can. I will always regret that Harry and I never made love. Married or not, I loved him, and I would have enjoyed relations with him. Women shouldn't be so prissy about those matters. If a woman can get some happiness by making love with a man, then they should by all means do it. But what if you'd had a child? Violet tried not to be scandalized, but everything she'd ever known was in direct contrast to this woman's words. I would have loved that little bastard baby with everything inside me. I am partial to bastard children. Violet smiled, shaking her head. If her mother had any idea her companion had these ideas, she would have a fit. But you don't think I should have relations with Jonas, do you? Oh, yes you should, Edna insisted. If you have the opportunity, I think you should push him to the ground and have your way with him. He looks like a man who knows his way around a woman's body. But, you're my chaperone. You're supposed to tell me that's a really bad idea. You're supposed to tell me to wait until marriage and help me protect my reputation. Oh, I'll help you protect your reputation. For instance, if anyone asks if you were alone with Jonas earlier, my answer will be no. I will tell them that I was with you the entire time, and you've only been alone with the door cracked. We'll only be caught if you end up having his bastard child. Edna peered down with her head hanging upside down from the top bunk. You're not carrying his bastard child, are you? You know I'm not. I just told you we kissed for the first time a few minutes ago. Oh, well, if you do get pregnant, you just let me know. I will help you any way I can. Her head disappeared. I sure do love babies, Violet smiled. I do too. I'll never have one, but I love them. Don't say that, Violet. I think you're going to have a baby soon. Hopefully you and Jonas will marry first, but you'll have a baby. Violet didn't respond. How did one respond when they realized that what they'd wanted their entire life was different than what they wanted now? Why, she'd almost be willing to give up painting if Jonas could keep making her stomach feel the way he had. Chapter 6. Violet felt the train lurch to a stop and almost fell from her bed. She stood, rubbing her eyes. 7 days on a train. Where were they? She'd enjoyed watching the landscape as they'd passed through the western part of the country. She stood, straightened her nightgown, which had become bunched around her waist, and went to peer out the window to see if there would be any indication where they were. They'd passed through so many cities. She'd even seen Billings where her sisters lived, but she hadn't been there long enough to go find them for a teary reunion. She'd asked if they could stay in Billings for a day or two, but they would have had to have their car unhitched from the train, and it wouldn't have worked. She'd understood, but she certainly hadn't liked it. Looking out, she could see a huge body of water. That couldn't be the ocean yet, so where were they? She looked over to see Edna with her head hanging off the top bunk, sound asleep. Well, she certainly wouldn't know, would she? Violet cautiously slid open the door of their room and wandered into the hall. She knew that Hillary was keeping track of where they were as they traveled so she could teach Nathan about a bit of geography pertaining to where they were each day. She knew the other woman would be up, because the sun was, and little Nathan was determined that if the sun was awake, he should be. She walked through the hall, to Jonas's door. She stopped for a moment and listened, wondering if she'd hear his snores. She knew she should just walk on, but she was drawn to him as she'd never been drawn to any man before him. Jonas had avoided being alone with her since their first day on the train, and she missed him. She hoped that he wasn't angry with her for responding to him the way she had. Edna kept telling her to sneak into his room at night, but she wasn't that bold. The door opened and she sucked in a breath with surprise. She hated that she'd been caught lurking outside his door. He was dressed for the day and stood looking at her for a moment, his height intimidating her slightly. "Good morning," she murmured, pivoting to hurry away. She wasn't ready to tell him why she was standing with her ear to his door when he opened it. She must seem like an imbecile. Jonas reached out and grabbed her arm. Why had she been standing outside his door in her nightgown? "What were you doing outside my door?" he asked. He'd wanted to seek her out repeatedly during their trip, but he couldn't. He had something he had to accomplish before he could ever start a relationship with anyone, no matter how much he wanted to. Violet shrugged, trying to pull her arm away from him. "I was just wondering where we are. The train has stopped, and there's water. We can't be to the Atlantic Ocean yet." "Chicago." His eyes wandered up and down her body, clothed only in a thin nightgown. Do you always walk about the train early in the morning in only your nightgown? Not that he was complaining now, but he would if another man saw her. Only his eyes should feast on her beautiful body. Violet gasped. She'd completely forgotten she wasn't dressed yet in her endeavor to discover where they were. Of course not. I woke up and saw the water, and I wanted to know where we were. I knew Hillary would know, so I was heading to their room to ask her. Her words sounded off even to her own ears, but she didn't know what else to say. And you got stuck outside my door? Jonas enjoyed her discomfort a bit too much. He wanted her badly, and it made him short-tempered. He kept telling himself she was too young for him, and she needed to be home with her mother, but his body wasn't agreeing with him at all. Well, we haven't kissed since that first day, and I was wondering if you were awake or not. The words made no sense even to her, and she knew he was going to think her a ninny. You wondered if I was awake because we hadn't kissed again? Were you wanting me to kiss you again this morning? Violet blushed. No, that's not what I was saying. Why was he twisting her words? But she did want him to kiss her again. Maybe she should follow Edna's advice after all. No, she shouldn't crawl into bed with him, but she could certainly tell him that she wanted him to kiss her. What could it hurt? Yes, I do want you to kiss me again, though. Jonas's eyes were drawn to her lips. Her hair was still mussed from sleep, and he could see a red mark on her cheek from where she must have had her face resting against her hand. All you have to do is ask. Even in her disheveled state, she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. He pulled her toward him by the grip he still had on her arm, leaning down and kissing her passionately. He didn't want to frighten her, but all he'd thought about since their kiss was doing it again, which is why he had avoided her. He put all the heat and emotion he felt for her in that one kiss, one hand going to her bottom and squeezing it through the thin fabric of her nightgown, the other hand going to her breast and cupping it, his thumb unerringly finding her nipple. She let out a gasp at his intimate touch. No man had ever seen her without a corset, much less in her nightgown. To feel him touch her in those private places made her heart beat faster, and the feeling in her stomach intensified. She wrapped both her arms around him, and met his tongue with hers. This really isn't a good idea, he whispered against her lips. But if we both enjoy it, I don't know why not. She leaned her head to the side as his kisses traveled across her cheek and down her neck to give him better access. Because you're a virgin. Because you should be with your companion, not with the man she's supposed to be protecting you from. He gave her bottom one last squeeze and pushed her away from him. Go back to Edna, Violet. But why? Who does it hurt? She knew she'd been listening to Edna too much, but she was the only other person there. The only person who would talk to Violet and answer her questions. If I like it, and you like it, I see no reason to deny ourselves the pleasure. He stared at her for a moment, grabbing her hand to pull her into his room. Do you even understand what happens between a man and a woman? In the marriage bed? He knew his question was blunt, but at that moment, she seemed to need him to be as plain-spoken as possible. Yes, I do, she answered proudly. She wasn't certain she was ready for that with him yet, but if she'd do it with anyone, it would be with him. He seemed to understand her in a way other men didn't. Every day she knew him, whether they spent time alone or not, she felt her feelings for him grow more and more. Well, you know that it all starts with kissing and caressing, right? If we keep this up, we're not going to stop. What would you do if you became pregnant? Violet blushed, but met his gaze steadily. Well, I guess I'd have a bastard baby, wouldn't I? Edna says she loves them and would help me take care of it. He blinked a few times, not believing she'd really said that. Your reputation would be in tatters. You can't have a bastard baby. Not that he'd let her anyway. Any real man knew it was his duty to marry a woman who carried his child. I already told you, I'm not worried about my reputation. I worry about the implications on my family, and I'll behave perfectly in Seattle, but I'm not in Seattle. I'm in Chicago. It took her a moment to remember where he'd said they were. The constant travel was starting to wear on her. I know you don't think you'll ever marry, but you don't want to have a relationship with a man without a marriage. You need to listen to me on this. I wouldn't ever forgive myself if I took your innocence. Unless we were married, a little voice added in his head. We could always marry. She stared at him for a moment, wanting nothing more than to convince him that she wanted him to take her innocence, but honestly? She wasn't certain if she did. She wasn't entirely certain how she felt about him yet. She only knew she enjoyed his kisses. Well, why can't we keep kissing and touching, but not do that? I enjoy your touch. It inspires me. It makes me want to paint beautiful things. How could something that made her want to paint be wrong? He shook his head. I really don't think any kind of touching between us is a good idea, Violet. Not right now. I have to stay focused on what I need to do once we get to New York. You mean get Emily Grace's house cleaned out? That, and watching her murderer receive justice. I'm going to be in the room when they put him to death. She shuddered. How could you watch that? She'd never imagined even wanting to do something like that. How could I not? If I don't see him die, I'll never believe that it really happened. I have to know that he pays for what he did to my sister. I will be there. She took a step back. Well, I'll try not to be a distraction then. If you find you need someone, I'm always here. I do like you, Jonas. I want to spend time with you. She didn't want to walk away, but she knew she had no choice. Until that part of his life was put to rest, he would have no time for her. I want to spend time with you too. Under any other circumstances. He let his voice trail off there. I can't have a relationship with you right now, Violet. I have to see this done first. After? Who knows where life will lead us? Less than 2 weeks later, Edna and Violet were walking through Central Park with Nathan and Hillary. Nathan was pointing out his favorite picnic spots, while Hillary was trying to keep him walking calmly along the path without getting too excited. Since they'd made it to New York, Jonas had made himself scarce. Violet had barely seen him, and every time she did, he looked exhausted. He was obviously taking meals somewhere other than the house, because she went down to dinner every night, hoping to see him. She knew he was spending long days packing up different parts of the house, but he always did it with the door locked. He wouldn't allow anyone to be part of what he was going through. It was as if he couldn't do it if he knew there were people who cared for him and wanted to help him through it. Do you know what Jonas is doing today? Violet asked Edna, trying to sound casual. Edna sighed. He seems to be avoiding all of us. I know he's done a lot of packing in the last week. I think today may have been the execution. Violet bit her lip. She hoped Jonas wouldn't go through with seeing the man electrocuted. She couldn't imagine anything more gruesome than watching a man die, but she'd never been in Jonas's position. I hope not. I hate the idea of him sitting there watching that. You're too soft-hearted. You hate the idea of anyone dying, and you don't understand justice. Would you want to be there? Violet just couldn't imagine it. Edna stopped walking and looked at Violet for a moment before answering. I just don't know. If it was someone I love, maybe. I've never really thought about it at all. I hope he's all right after being there through it. I can't even imagine what I would be going through as I watched someone executed. Violet looked up and saw that Nathan and Hillary had gotten far away from them. We'd better walk a bit faster or we'll be left in the park without our young guide. Nathan turned around and looked at them. Hurry up. I want you to see where Mama and I went on a picnic for my birthday. As sad as New York made Jonas, Nathan was in his element, showing off all the places he loved to the 3 women with him. Violet tried to join the boy for at least one walk in the park every day, but often she needed to be painting. Jonas had taken her to his sister's studio on the 2nd floor of her home and invited her to make it her own on their first day in the city. She had barely seen him since. At first, Violet had a hard time using things that she knew had been purchased by another artist, but after a bit, it started feeling right to her that she would be painting in this place. Nathan had shown her the only photograph he had of his parents, and she was making a painting from the photograph for him. She thought it would be something that he would always treasure, especially if it was done in his mother's studio with her own paints. That evening, Jonas wasn't at supper as usual. Late after all the others were in bed, she came down the stairs from her studio, to find him in his office, with the door wide open. He was sitting at his desk, with a single glass of amber-colored liquid in front of him. It didn't seem as if he'd taken even a sip. "Are you all right?" Violet asked from the doorway, after taking in his unkempt look and his sad eyes. "Oh, I'm fine. I'm always fine." He sighed. "Did you know that it hurts a man when he's electrocuted? That you can actually see the pain in his face as he flops when the electricity is pumped into his body?" Violet went into the room and shut the door quietly behind her. "Did it help you to see it?" He shrugged. "I know justice has been served. It doesn't help me to see a former friend of mine executed, but seeing Emily Grace's murderer killed is something else entirely." He took a sip of his drink. "Why did he kill her?" Jonas sighed. "Money. Why else? He was dead broke. He had a gambling problem and I knew about it. I stopped lending him money to get out of trouble, and I told my brother-in-law to do the same. I gave him enough money to pay off all his gambling debts before I left town, and he racked them all up again. He went to Albert to ask for money, and when he refused, he waited a few days, and invited them both to see a play." He swirled the liquid in his glass, not meeting her eyes. "When they arrived, they walked together toward the play, and he pulled a gun on them in a dark alley. He knew she'd wear her jewels. A witness heard the whole thing without being seen. They said he was crying as he shot them. He told them if it were anyone else, he wouldn't have to kill them, but they could identify him." "That's horrible." Violet wished she had an answer. That there was something, anything she could say to make him feel better. "It is. The sad thing is, he was my very closest friend in school. I introduced him to my sister and brother-in-law. I helped him murder my family." He took another sip of his drink. "I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life." Violet felt a tear streaming down her face and wiped it away impatiently. "I wish I knew how to make it better for you." "That's the thing. No one can make it better. It's my fault, and I'll have to someday face Nathan and tell him it's my fault." "It's not your fault. Did you hand him the gun? Did you suggest he murder Emily Grace for her jewels?" He sighed. "I might as well have. The sad truth is that if I hadn't introduced them, they would still be alive today. They're not." He rubbed his hand over his eyes as if it was all too much for him to deal with. "He looked out over the room and saw me sitting there. His eyes looked straight at me as if he blamed me for the whole thing." Violet stood and walked around the desk. She had no idea what she intended to do, but she knew he needed human touch. She rubbed his shoulders gently, and kissed the top of his head as he sat in his chair, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Do you feel better knowing justice was done?" He stood abruptly and pulled her into his arms, holding her close. Not kissing her, just holding her tightly. Her arms wrapped around him, her hands going to his shoulders. He buried his face in her hair, clutching her to him. They stood like that for several minutes, not saying anything, and neither of them moved to make the embrace intimate. Finally, he pulled away from her. "Thank you for caring." Violet smiled up at him. "I hope I was able to help in some small way." He nodded. "You were. Now, sit. Let's talk for a moment." Violet walked around the desk and took the seat she'd just vacated, giving him her full attention. "How are you coming with paintings for the show?" He was suddenly all business, as if nothing had transpired between them. "I have 2 ready, and I'm working on a 3rd. She thought about the painting she was doing for Nathan, but decided against mentioning it to him. There was no reason to add to his grief. "Good. Do you have time to have dinner with me tomorrow night?" He knew he should use more finesse when asking a lady out, but he seemed to forget every rule when it came to her. She looked at him for a moment, thinking about his question. Did he mean just the 2 of them, or dinner with their entire ensemble? With everyone? He shook his head. "No, just the 2 of us. I'd like to take you to dinner and then to see the gallery here. You haven't even asked to see where your paintings will be displayed." "It's enough for me to know they will be displayed." She shrugged. I'm just happy people are paying attention to my work. Dinner? She nodded slowly. She really wanted to know him better. The more she'd gotten to know him, the more Edna's words in her ear made sense to her. What did it matter if she had a child? She wasn't going to marry anyway, and she needed to take her happiness where she could. She could definitely be happy with Jonas. I'd like that a great deal. Jonas smiled and nodded, his eyes still tired. Be ready to leave by 6:30. I'll wait for you in the foyer. She thought about her clothes. She'd had one dress made since arriving in New York, but there was another that would be ready in time for her show. She could wear the dress that had already been delivered. She didn't know which shoes to wear, though. Will we be doing a lot of walking? He shook his head. Not tomorrow night. We'll be getting a cab. I want it to be special. You do? She asked with surprise. He was thinking about making their first outing special? Did that mean he cared for her? Of course I do. It's the first time we've done any formal courting. I want it to be very special for you. She was surprised, but pleased. She loved the idea of having a formal courtship with him. Even if they never married, and she doubted they would, she could have a nice time with him. That's all that really mattered, right? I'd like that a lot. All the next day, while she worked and while they went on their daily walk in Central Park, Violet thought about her evening with Jonas. What would it be like? He said he'd take her to dinner, but what would it be like to be with a man? He hadn't suggested they take Edna with them, so presumably he didn't want a chaperone. Edna helped her with her hair. Are you certain you don't want me to loan you a hat? I brought 12 of them. Violet had seen Edna's taste in hats. No, but I thank you. I prefer to only wear hats in the daytime. This is an evening excursion. She stood and walked to her bed where her new dress was laid out. The dress was white, with a fitted waist and lace ruffles along her chest. It was the one she'd had made there in New York, so she knew it was the latest fashion. Even Rose would approve. She pulled the dress over her head and turned so Edna could button the back of her dress for her. When she was finished, Violet stood in front of a full-length mirror and studied her appearance. She put her hand over her belly to try to calm her nerves. She'd already kissed him, so she didn't have to worry about that. What was making her so nervous? Edna smiled. It's going to be fine. Just remember, if he wants to take you to his bed tonight, make sure you let me know so I can sleep in your bed, so the servants won't know what happened. Violet didn't even gasp in shock as she would have 3 weeks before. I'm not going to his bed tonight, Edna. This is our first real outing together. What kind of woman would she be if she ran off to share his bed that night? Well, if you get the chance, I think you should jump at it. He's had a rough couple of weeks. Nothing makes a man feel better than a little bouncing on a mattress with his favorite lady, at least that's what I've been told. Edna, my mother would not be pleased with the advice you give me as my chaperone. I just have to point that out to you. Violet loved the old woman, but she knew her mother would be very unhappy with the things she was always saying to her. Oh, I know. Your mother is an old stick in the mud. I don't care if she's younger than me. She acts years older. It's sad. Edna shook her head. Violet suppressed a giggle. You're right. I think it's so many years of being responsible for daughters that did it to her. I guess it's good I never had children. I wouldn't want to act old like she does. Violet took one last glance into the mirror to make certain she looked all right. Am I ready? She asked, looking over her shoulder at Edna. You're beautiful. You were before you started fixing your hair, and you know it. Edna pulled her into a brief hug. I hope you'll think about what I said about giving the boy a tumble. He would be so much happier if you did. Violet laughed. I don't know if that's a good enough reason to give him my virginity. You need a reason? Edna asked with a wink. Violet shook her head at the older woman and headed for her bedroom door. The time with Edna was certainly skewing her view of the world. She almost thought it would be a good idea to have relations with Jonas. Chapter 7. Violet descended the stairs slowly, knowing that Jonas's eyes were on her. He was dressed in formal clothes, including a black suit with tails and a black bow tie. Jonas stood nervously as he watched Violet come down the stairs toward him. He'd always been attracted to her, but until that moment, she'd never taken his breath away. She was truly the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, and he wasn't certain how much longer he'd be able to resist her charms. He wanted her, but it was more than that. He'd wanted women many times. Violet was special. She walked straight up to him, smiling. Her shoes had a bit of a heel on them. She'd bought them since they'd arrived in New York, just so she wouldn't feel that she was at such a disadvantage when she stood beside him. "Where are we going?" He smiled. "I thought we'd go to eat at a small restaurant I know near Broadway, and there's a play I thought you'd enjoy that we'll go to after. It's called Rosemary. It's a comedy. Have you ever seen one?" She shook her head. "I haven't, but it sounds nice." She'd been to plays in Seattle, of course, but none that were with famous actors. She was certain that any play in New York City would be better than one that would come to Seattle. He opened the door for her, and once they were on the sidewalk in front of the house, he offered her his arm. It was early November, and the sky was dark. There were electric streetlights that lit the way to the coach he had waiting at the street. He opened the door for her and helped her step into the closed coach and climbed in after her, waiting while the driver closed the door and removed the stairs. He sat beside her on the seat. "This way neither of us have to sit backward," he told her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "I'd rather sit close to you anyway," she said, snuggling into him. "I've missed you while you've been taking care of business." She knew it wasn't the right thing to say, but she just didn't care. She wasn't going to hide how she felt from him, because there was no purpose behind it. He looked at her with surprise. He hadn't expected her to say that. "I'm sorry I've been so distant. Packing up her things and knowing I'd have to watch John be executed, it's been hard for me. Are you doing better today?" She rested her head against his shoulder as they talked, wishing she had the courage to just kiss him. She knew Edna would tell her to just throw him on the floor of the coach and have her way with him, but really? She wouldn't know what to do with him once he was on the floor. He nodded. "I really am. I think I needed to see it happen, so I'd know they got justice and put it behind me. Yesterday was a rough day, but today all I could think about was the beautiful young artist I was going to take to dinner." Her heart jumped when he said she was beautiful. Did he really see her that way? "You were thinking about me that much and you still haven't kissed me?" Edna would not approve. He chuckled. "Is she telling you to kiss me?" Violet wondered if she should tell him exactly what Edna had been suggesting she do, but decided against it. "Oh, yes. She thinks that women are too uptight." He pulled her closer. "Do you think I should kiss you? I'd be happy to skip dinner and the play and just sit here in the coach kissing all night." "Of course, I'm not sure that's a good idea." He groaned. "I know it's not a good idea. We do have about 10 minutes before we'll reach the restaurant, though." He turned to her more fully, and put his hand under her chin, tipping her face up to his. "Seems like a wasted opportunity if I don't kiss you, doesn't it?" She nodded, her eyes meeting his by the light of a street lamp they passed. "It certainly does." He leaned toward her and brushed his lips across hers. She turned fully toward him, her arms going to his back and stroking his shoulders through his jacket. She pressed as close to him as she could, wishing she had the courage to put her hands under his jacket and touch his muscular shoulders. He groaned deeply in his throat, his tongue seeking entrance to her mouth to mate with hers. The coach stopped and he pulled away quickly, looking out the window. "We're here." "Oh, good gravy." Violet touched her fingers to her lips. For once she didn't mind that she was starting to sound like Edna. That wasn't nearly enough time. He sighed. "Well, we're walking to the theater, because it's only a block, but we'll have the ride home." She smiled. "I'm counting on it." The restaurant was by far the fanciest Violet had ever eaten in. The tablecloths were white and the waiters all had white cloths over their arms. She had no idea what to order in a place like that, so she had Jonas order for her. The waiter brought them steak and baked potatoes along with a bottle of red wine. Violet had never had wine, but she didn't want to admit it, because she knew that the women Jonas was used to would have no problem drinking wine by the barrelful. She took a sip, and despite not liking the taste, kept sipping at it throughout the meal. He refilled her glass twice as they chatted about everything from Seattle to the art gallery here in New York City. "I can't wait to see it," she told him. "I'm really excited to have a show here in New York." He nodded at her. "Tomorrow I'll take you to meet the manager. You'll be working mostly with him for the show. We've got it set for 2 months from now. Will that give you enough time to get everything ready?" "It should. As long as there isn't a minimum number of paintings you need me to have. I've had several hours to work every day since our arrival." "Good. I'd like to see some of what you've finished tomorrow as well, if you don't mind." She shook her head, surprised at how lightheaded she felt. "I'd like to show you what I've done." She didn't mention the painting she'd almost finished for Nathan of his parents, unsure how Jonas would feel about it. The waiter brought the bill then, and Jonas paid it discreetly. He helped Violet to her feet and they left the restaurant. She was a bit chilled by the November air, and he removed his coat to put it over her shoulders. She'd never had a man do that before, but she'd seen it happen with her sisters many times, and had been overwhelmed by the romance of it. "Thank you," she said, leaning heavily on his arm as she walked. She had a feeling she'd had a few too many drinks, because her head felt a bit funny. He stopped at a small theater and took her inside. They had a seat in the front row, and she sat close beside him. As the play unfolded before them, Jonas found he couldn't watch the stage, because he was too busy watching her. Every time she laughed, he felt a smile cross his lips. If she frowned, he frowned. How had he become so infatuated with this young slip of a girl? Had he lost his mind? After the play, he helped her into the coach and once again sat beside her. As soon as the coach started moving, she turned to him and wound her arms around him, pulling his head down to hers for a kiss. For the first time, she was the aggressor, and she plunged her tongue into his mouth, letting it toy with his. Everything she felt when they kissed came rushing to her. She never wanted to let this man go. Maybe Edna's advice wasn't so terrible after all. He gathered her close, surprised that she would kiss him so passionately, but certainly not willing to argue with her about it. She'd been hanging around her companion too much, and he hoped she wasn't taking all of the older woman's advice. By the time they reached the house, he was ready to throw her over his shoulder and carry her up the stairs to his bedroom and have his way with her. Of course, he couldn't do that. She was a business associate and a virgin. He couldn't do that to her. He knew if he kept telling himself that he'd eventually believe it. When the coach stopped, he pulled back, breathing heavily. "You're going to make me crazy, Violet." She swallowed hard, trying to control the feelings rushing through her body. "What did I do wrong?" "Nothing. Everything you do is exactly right. That's the problem. I can't stop touching you. I want to take you upstairs to my room and do things I shouldn't do with you." "You want to fornicate with me?" She couldn't stop herself from using Edna's phrase. The woman really was a bad influence over her. He coughed to cover a laugh. "Did Edna call it that?" She nodded. "I learn a lot from Edna." "I'm sure you do. I'm just as sure your mother doesn't want you learning the things Edna's teaching you." "Probably not." She looked at him, wondering if he was disappointed in her that she was listening to the older woman so much. "Does it bother you?" "Of course not." He couldn't believe she'd even ask. "She's a sweet old lady, just don't tell your mother when you write home and all will be good." He waited for the coachman to open the door and quickly stepped down, holding his hand up to help her. As they walked toward the house, she looked up at him. "I had a wonderful time. I'm not ready for the night to end." He slipped his arm around her waist, glad she'd enjoyed herself as much as he had. "Do you want to go to my study and talk for a bit longer?" She thought about it for a moment before shaking her head. "No. I want to go upstairs to your room with you. Edna says I'll regret it if I don't take my happiness where I can find it." He opened the front door, looking down into her eyes. I don't think that's a good idea, Violet. I can't let you do that. It's my body and my choice. She started for the stairs. She knew which room was his. She'd go there on her own if she had to. Jonas sighed and watched her go, wishing he'd handled that better. He wanted her, yes, but he wanted her for a wife. He knew he wasn't going to be able to wait much longer for her. Violet undressed and slipped into Jonas's huge bed. She covered herself to her neck so nothing would be seen if he came in. He could touch all he wanted, but she wasn't ready for him to see her unclothed just yet. What if he didn't like how she looked? It didn't take long for the combined effects of the long day, and the 3 glasses of wine she'd had with dinner to take effect, and she fell asleep. Jonas climbed the stairs, tired and sad about how badly he'd handled the evening with Violet. He hated that he'd hurt her feelings, when all he'd meant to do was keep her innocent until they could marry. He'd talk to her in the morning, and ask her to be his bride. He hoped she wouldn't insist on waiting until her mother could come out to join them, and he knew that he wasn't willing to wait until they went back to Seattle, no matter how much she wanted to. He quickly stripped in the dark, dropping his clothes on the floor beside the bed and climbed between the sheets. He stretched out an arm and felt. Wait, she hadn't. He leaned over to twist the socket key of the electric lamp beside his bed. When the light came on, he could see her sleeping on her side, her hand tucked under her cheek. He reached over to wake her, under the cover, and encountered bare flesh. Really? She'd been that bold? Violet. Violet, wake up. He needed to send her back to her own room immediately. He couldn't make love with her yet. He wanted their wedding night to be their first time. And he wanted their wedding night to be the next night. He wanted that badly. Violet came awake slowly, at first not certain where she was. When she opened her eyes and saw Jonas, she smiled and slid toward him in the bed. Violet, no, you need to go back to your own room. I'm not doing this. She sighed. Why not? You want to. You told me you did. Yes, but not like this. I care about you. We can't just do this, because it will feel good. We need to marry first. She blinked a few times. Are you asking me to marry you? Well, darn it. He hadn't meant to ask her that way. I certainly didn't mean to ask you like that. I was planning on taking you for a walk in the park tomorrow and getting down on one knee to ask you to marry me. She smiled and moved closer to him under the covers, her hands going to his chest. I like that idea. Do that tomorrow. He smiled. He couldn't help but appreciate her enthusiasm. What will your answer be if I do? I guess you'll have to ask to find out, won't you? He laughed. You're naked in my bed, and you're playing games with me. What is wrong with you, woman? She moved even closer until her breasts were pressed against his bare chest. She could feel his hair against her nipples, and she shuddered with pleasure. Reaching out, she pulled his mouth to hers, kissing him as he'd taught her. Her hands roamed over his bare back. He wanted to marry her, even knowing she'd never give up her career. She was going to be so happy with him. Jonas kissed her back for a brief moment, before putting his hands to her shoulders and setting her away from him. No. Not until we're married. You need to get dressed and go back to your room. She sighed. Edna will make it look like I slept in my bed. You need to quit worrying. Why was everyone always so worried about her reputation? He shook his head. I'm not worried about how people will see it. I'm worried that it will bother you that we did something we shouldn't have before we married. He sighed. As much as I hate saying it, you need to go. But I want to at least stay here with you. Even if we don't do anything, I want to be able to lay here and touch you. He wouldn't deny her that, would he? You don't understand. If you stay here, we will do something I don't think we should do. I really need you to go back to your room, sweetheart. We'll talk more tomorrow, but for now, I need you to go. She sighed, rolling to her back. You need to turn away from me then. I don't want you to see me. He'd already felt her pressed up against him, so he didn't see the harm in seeing her, but he obediently turned to his side facing the wall, so she could dress. As soon as he was turned away, the door slammed open. "What do you think you're doing?" Edna stood in her nightgown like an avenging angel. Her white hair stood up at angles atop her head. "Good gravy, child. You didn't think I was serious, did you? You're much too young to be doing this without marriage. Get out of that bed, put your drawers back on, and get in your own bed where you belong. I've lost my cough tonic, and I need you to help me find it anyway. I was just leaving, and no, we didn't do anything." Violet hung her head. She hated that she'd been caught naked in his bed. She jumped up and dressed quickly. As she was about to leave, Jonas's voice stopped her. "I'll be taking you for that walk in the morning, Violet." Violet nodded once, and hurried from the room and around the corner. She'd never felt quite so embarrassed or so happy in her life. Who knew both emotions could exist at the same time? When she reached her room, Edna followed her inside. "What was right for me at 35 isn't right for you at 20, girl. I need you to realize that I think kissing and hugging is just fine, but you don't want to be messing up your whole life by anticipating your marriage vows. What would you say to your future husband if you went to him a non-virgin?" Violet shrugged. "I don't know. I just know that I have very strong feelings for Jonas, and I want to be his wife." "Is that a crime?" "Of course it's not a crime. It's also not smart at this point. You need to do what's right. What if he's only acting interested in you to get into your drawers?" Violet sat on the edge of her bed and looked at Edna. Her hair was still sticking up all over her head as if she'd just woken up. Is that what had happened? She'd woken up and gone in to check on her and realized she wasn't in her room. "He asked me to leave. He told me he wants me, but he doesn't want to do anything before we marry. He's taking me for a walk in the morning to ask me to be his wife." "He told you he's going to propose?" Edna sank onto the bed beside Violet. "That's strange. I don't think he meant to tell me. He was trying to explain to me why I shouldn't be in his bed, and the words just kind of came out." "Huh. Well, maybe he's not just trying to get into your drawers after all. Of course, he did take you to his bed and take your clothes off." Violet looked down at her hands with a blush. "No, he didn't." She wasn't sure she could admit what had really happened, but she couldn't let Edna blame Jonas for something he didn't do. "What do you mean he didn't? Have you lost your mind, girl?" "Well, I listened to everything you said, and I thought you wanted me to make love with him. So when he told me to go to bed, I went to his bed instead. I stripped and fell asleep waiting for him. He didn't even know I was in his bed until he got into it himself." Violet peeked up at Edna to see what her reaction was. For a moment, it looked as if Edna was going to yell at her, and suddenly the old woman started laughing. "You sure did take my advice to heart, didn't you?" She leaned forward and hugged Violet tightly. "Get into your nightgown and go to sleep." Violet watched the older woman walk across her room, wondering exactly what had happened to make her a more conscientious chaperone. Had she really done that kind of about-face? Or had she been joking all along? "What about your cough tonic?" "Oh, I had it with me all along." "You don't really think I'd lose my cough tonic, do you?" Edna grinned as she left. Chapter 8. Violet woke with a smile on her face and a spring in her step the next morning. Jonas would be asking her to marry him, and she couldn't wait. She knew she should immediately message her mother that a wedding was pending, but she was certain she'd rather just telegraph her once they were married so she couldn't try to stop them from marrying quickly. She was certain Jonas wasn't willing to wait another day longer than they had to, and with as much as she enjoyed kissing him, she wasn't willing to wait either. At breakfast, she couldn't quit grinning. She knew she should be embarrassed by being found in Jonas's bed with him, but she just wasn't. Jonas came down just as she finished her meal and his eyes went to hers immediately. "Are you ready for our walk?" he asked. He hadn't planned on asking her so early in the day, but he had to. He had to get it out of the way, so they could find a preacher and get the wedding over with. He hadn't thought he'd be nervous when the time came for him to actually marry, but he was. What if he wasn't what she needed? Violet nodded and bounded out of her chair. She walked to his side, wishing he'd kiss her good morning, but in the light of day with the servants all around them, she didn't think he'd do it. Jonas looked down into her upturned face glowing with happiness, and he knew he was doing the right thing. For both them and Nathan. Nathan would be so pleased that he'd have a new woman to act as mama in his life. He took her hand and started for the front door, ready to get on with it. Wait. You can't leave the house together with no chaperone. What are you thinking? Edna came barreling down the stairs toward them. You let us last night, Violet protested. What's the difference? She couldn't believe Edna was choosing today to start acting like a real chaperone. The difference was last night you were with a coachman in a busy part of town. Today, you'll be walking alone in the park. Yes, Central Park is a busy place, but there are plenty of places in the trees to hide. Edna walked up to Violet and looked into her eyes. And last night I caught you naked in his bed. I don't trust you anymore. Violet made a face. I guess you're coming with us then. Maybe we should bring Hillary and Nathan, so everyone can chaperone us. Is one chaperone even enough? She asked sarcastically. She wanted to be alone with Jonas. Why did they need a chaperone? I think that's a great idea. That's why I asked Hillary to get Nathan ready for a walk in the park before I came down. You didn't really think we were going to let you slip away and get engaged without us, did you? Jonas sighed. You told her we were getting engaged today? Violet shrugged. I had to explain my behavior somehow. Jonas raised an eyebrow. Fine. We'll take everyone. What do I care? He dropped his voice to a whisper, his lips almost touching Violet's ear. As long as they're not in the bedroom with us on our wedding night, I don't care at all. Violet blushed at his words. That would not be good. I heard that. Edna said loudly. No more whispering, you two. I may be old, but I can still hear. She walked to the bottom of the stairs and bellowed up, Hurry up, Hillary. They're ready to go. Hillary rushed from the nursery pulling Nathan along by his hand. They hurried down the stairs. Once they reached the bottom, Nathan tore away from his nurse and rushed over to his uncle. Uncle Jonas. I missed you. Jonas dropped to one knee and hugged the boy tightly. He looked up at Violet for a moment before he said, I need to talk to you about something for a minute before we go. Man to man. Nathan pulled himself up to his full height and nodded. Jonas stood and led the boy into his study, where he sat behind the desk. After Nathan crawled into the chair in front of the desk, he said, I know you've been wanting me to marry so you can have someone to be like a mother to you. How would you feel if I married Violet? Nathan looked at him with a blank face for a moment, and then he suddenly smiled. Yes. Marry her, Uncle Jonas. Jonas smiled. I think I'm going to ask her in the park today. Do you want to help me? He had an idea, and he knew Nathan would enjoy having a part in it. Nathan nodded. Yes, please. Jonas whispered his plan and together they walked back into the foyer to join the others. He took Violet's hand. Are we all ready for our walk? Violet looked at him questioningly, but when he didn't respond, she shrugged. If he wanted to tell her, he would. It was a short walk to Central Park from the house. Nathan held one of Violet's hands, and Jonas held the other. When they reached the park, Nathan led them to a spot where they'd picnicked on their first full day in New York City. It had been his favorite spot to go and eat with his mother before she'd died, and he'd wanted to share it with Violet. When they reached the top of the small hill, Nathan said, You need to sit down in the grass. He was all but jumping up and down with excitement over something. Violet looked at Jonas before obeying. What are you two up to? She asked, a smile touching her lips. Nathan and Jonas looked at each other before they each dropped to one knee. Will you? Jonas began. Marry us? They finished together. Violet laughed. I have to think about this. So let's see. I would really be marrying Jonas, but I'd be getting Nathan when I married him, right? She pretended she hadn't known the proposal was coming for the boy's sake, knowing it would make him feel special. Nathan nodded happily. Yes, you would get me. I'd be your little boy, and I would call you Aunt Violet. The grin on his face told her that including him was just the right thing to do. Jonas had been smart to talk to him about it. Well, I don't know about marrying your uncle, she said to Nathan, but I sure like the idea of you being my little boy. Yes, I suppose if that's the only way I can get you, I need to do it. I will marry him, and get you. Does that work, Nathan? Nathan scrambled to his feet and threw himself into her lap, hugging her tight. He planted a sweet kiss on her lips. Does that mean I get to eat supper with the grown-ups every night? Violet smiled. Most nights. I can't promise every night, but most nights you'll be with us. She held him close, resting her cheek on his head. I sure do love you, Nathan. Even enough to put up with that crazy uncle of yours. Nathan grinned. I'm so glad we get to keep you. He looked over his shoulder at Edna. Can we keep her, too? Violet followed his gaze and saw Edna watching them with tears streaming down her face. As they watched, Edna reached into her sleeve and pulled out 4 handkerchiefs, passing them around. Wipe your tears, people. Nothing to see here. Everyone politely accepted a handkerchief, but Edna was the only one crying. Violet's eyes met Jonas's. When? She knew it would have to be soon. The look he was giving her as she sat with his nephew on her lap in the middle of Central Park was enough to tell her that. Now. He walked to her and took Nathan off her lap, before taking her hand and pulling her to her feet. But first. He dipped his head, kissing her quickly. I wouldn't have felt engaged without that. He wished they were in private and the kiss could be deeper, but he made the best of the situation he was in. Now? By now, you mean? Did he mean tomorrow? Next week? I mean now. My former pastor is always in the church at this time of day. Let's go get him to just do it. He wanted the actual ceremony over with so he could spend the rest of his life with this woman. Violet frowned. Well, that sounds good to me, but my mother is going to kill me. She looked over at Edna. We'll have to let her give us a big reception when we get back to Seattle. Then she'll feel better, right? Edna shrugged. I think your mother is going to be unhappy with the speed of the wedding no matter what you do. Violet sighed. Well, I'm not waiting 6 months. Jonas's eyes widened. No, we're not waiting, we're going now. There was no way he could leave her a virgin until their wedding night if they waited 6 months. He wasn't certain he could even wait another week. Hillary took Nathan's hand. I'll take him back to the house. There's no reason for a little boy to attend a wedding. Nathan's face fell, all of the excitement leaving him. Yes, ma'am. Violet looked at Jonas, hoping he felt as she did about it. I think he should be there. He needs to be part of the ceremony that makes us a family. She didn't want him to feel left out. Hillary frowned. It wouldn't be proper, Jonas sighed. I don't care if it's proper or not. Violet's right. He needs to be there with us. His eyes met Edna's. You'll be the maid of honor, of course. He felt a pang as he realized he was keeping her from having her sisters with her on her wedding day. Would she be upset? Edna nodded, clapping her hands excitedly. Oh yes. And I need a petunia for my hair. Jonas closed his eyes, not wanting to even ask, but for some reason, feeling compelled to do so. Why a petunia? Well, I love Violet so much, I feel like she should be my sister, which makes me her sister. All of her sisters have flower names, but none of them were named Petunia, so I will claim that name now. Henceforth, you may call me Edna Petunia Blue. Jonas didn't even blink at her explanation. It was so Edna that he knew there was no point in arguing. Of course. Violet smiled. I'll need a Violet as well. Family tradition says we all have to have our namesake in our hair when we marry. Jonas nodded. I know where a small florist is. He looked at Hillary. Which flower do you need for your hair? He might as well just ask and get it over with. Hillary clapped her hands together excitedly. Do you have a sister named Pansy? Violet shook her head. I don't. I don't have a Poppy or a Lilac or a Heather either. Hillary thought for a moment. I think I'll be Lilac then, if you don't mind. I've always been partial to lilacs. Jonas turned to Nathan. You're not getting a flower for your hair, but you can be my best man if you'd like. I'd love that. Nathan walked away from Hillary and took Violet's hand. Thanks for not making me wear a flower in my hair. Violet giggled. I never will. I promise. It was a happy group who walked back to the house a few hours later. They'd had a wedding lunch at a small restaurant, and the women still had their flowers in their hair. Violet didn't really feel married, but she didn't know what married felt like. They'd taken the time to send her mother a telegram before returning to the house, and she knew there would be a response within a day or two. She just didn't know how angry her mother would be. Everyone went their separate ways when they returned to the house. Violet went to her room to pack up her things, to move them to Jonas's room. Edna Petunia helped her pack. Every time she'd called the older woman Edna since she'd announced her new name, she'd been corrected. The fact that Edna Petunia was a mouthful didn't seem to faze the older woman at all. She liked the new name, and it was all she was willing to answer to. Why don't you go paint, and I'll pack this for you? Edna asked. You don't need a companion anymore, now that you're married, and I need to earn my keep somehow. Violet smiled. Why would my new sister need to earn her keep? Edna dropped the pile of dresses in her arms and rushed across the room to hug Violet. I'm 70 years old, and you are the best friend I've ever had. I don't know what that says about me, but it's true. I'm so happy to have found you. Violet laughed. What does it say about me that I'm 20 and my best friend is 70? I think we make a good pair. And I do still need you. Who else would give me good advice about love? Edna wiped away a tear with her sleeve. Do you need a handkerchief? She asked Violet. No, I'm fine, Edna, thank you. She loved that the older woman cried at the drop of a hat and tried to act like everyone around her was crying as well. Edna Petunia, Edna corrected her. I'm sorry. Edna Petunia. They continued to work together in silence as they finished packing up the room. Do you need me to talk to you about the wedding night? Edna asked excitedly. She obviously liked the idea. Violet was tempted to have the older woman talk to her about it, just to hear what she'd say, but she decided to save herself the embarrassment. No, thank you. My sister had a talk with me before I left Seattle, just in case. She was glad Hyacinth had the foresight to do so now. Well, even though you know what will happen, I have to add my own little opinion to it. You need to be certain to relax and let yourself enjoy it. Don't worry about what you should or shouldn't do. Or what you should or shouldn't feel. You're married now, and you can do it if it feels good. Violet nodded, blushing a bit. It all felt good with Jonas. Did that mean that nothing was wrong or forbidden? Jonas stopped outside the door and listened to Edna's words. He knew then they'd made the right choice with her for companion. She was a good woman, and she was determined to make Violet's life better. He knocked on the open door. Are you ladies almost finished in here? Violet looked around the room. I think that's everything. Good. He took Violet's hand in his. I know it's not the normal way to do things, but this house seems to be a bit overpopulated at the moment. How would you feel about taking a night or two in a hotel here in town so we can have a bit of privacy? That sounds wonderful. She liked the idea of having some time completely alone with him. Edna clapped her hands together excitedly. Oh, which hotel will we stay in? Jonas looked at Edna and sighed. Well, I was thinking everyone but Violet and I would stay here. I want to be alone with my wife. Why did he have to have a house full of people when he had a new bride? Edna frowned. Oh yes, of course. It's just odd I've never stayed in a hotel. Jonas shook his head. It's not happening. Not right now. I'm sure it will happen soon. He looked back at Violet. Can you pack a bag for 2 nights? We'll stay in a hotel and just spend some time getting to know one another better. Edna snorted. I'll say you'll get to know one another better. Jonas glared at Edna. No one was speaking to you. Didn't she know when to keep her mouth shut? Well, if you're speaking in the room that I'm in, then I should be part of the conversation, don't you think? Jonas shook his head. No, I don't think so. He looked back at Violet. You can pack a bag? Violet had her hand over her mouth, trying her best not to giggle. She certainly understood Jonas's frustration with the older woman, but she couldn't help but laugh at his exasperation. Yes, I can be ready. When will we leave? How long will it take you to pack a bag? 20 minutes, she guessed. Then we'll leave in 30. That will give us enough time to say goodbye to Nathan for the 2 nights as well. Sounds good. Violet waited until he'd left the room before collapsing on the bed and laughing. Oh, Edna. You really shouldn't bait him that way. Edna grinned. That's Edna Petunia to you. Do you promise you'll come back? Nathan asked, wringing his little hands together nervously. Violet pulled the boy closer to her on the sofa where the 3 of them were sitting. Of course, we'll come back. We love you. We need to have you with us. I can stay with Hillary Lilac and Edna Petunia then. Nathan was the only one who could easily remember what the 2 women had chosen for their names. They'll take good care of you. When I get home, I have a surprise for you. Nathan's eyes lit up. You do? I do, but only if you're a good boy while we're gone. Violet smiled at the excitement on the little boy's face. I'll be the best little boy in all of New York. Jonas grinned and ruffled the boy's hair. I know you will. He embraced the boy tightly. We'll see you in 3 days. 2 sleeps. Nathan nodded. I'll take care of all the women while you're gone, Uncle Jonas. I know you will. Jonas got to his feet and took Violet's hand. Their things were already in the coach, waiting to be taken to the hotel he'd chosen. We'll miss you. Nathan sighed. I'll miss you, too. I wish I could go. It wouldn't be proper. Jonas waited for Violet to hug Nathan one last time. As they left, Violet looked at Jonas. At least I won't have to read my mother's telegram about what a terrible daughter I am until we get back. Why would this bother her so much? Violet sighed. She's angry that none of her daughters have given her time to plan a real wedding. We're always in a hurry to get married once we get engaged. She actually wanted me to be fitted for a wedding dress before we left so she could plan our wedding while we were gone. You know, yours and mine, we'd never even kissed. She shook her head in exasperation. Jonas laughed. Yes, I think your mother is going to be angry with you. She sighed. I know she is. Oh well. She got mad at all my sisters, too, but she'll be happy when we start giving her grandbabies. In our case, she'll be happy as soon as we get home. She'll be excited to get Nathan as a new grandchild. Will she just accept him that fast? He helped her into the coach and moved to sit beside her, his arm coming around her shoulders. Oh, yes. My sister Jasmine has twin stepsons who are absolute hellions. They are Jasmine all over again. Mama opened her arms wide and called them her grandbabies the very day they married. Violet snuggled into him, wondering if he'd kiss her now that they were finally alone. She wanted nothing more than to be intimate with him. She hoped it wouldn't take long to get to the hotel. Tell me about your sisters, he suggested, glancing out the window. It was a 30-minute drive to the hotel, and he wasn't going to start anything he couldn't finish in a coach. Well, he could finish it in a coach, but not her first time. He'd take her on a long drive someday, though. Violet smiled. She'd never in her life gone this long without seeing at least one of her sisters. Well, Rose is the oldest. She's always been really fashion conscious. When she was young, she had men falling all over themselves for her. She's married to Sean Henry. He's a dentist. She's also the reason Aunt Harriet agreed to investigate all of our suitors. Why does your aunt do it? He asked. He had been surprised when her mother said her sister-in-law had investigated him when they'd been at the train station in Seattle. It wasn't a job that would usually be given to a woman. Before she came to Seattle to marry my uncle, she was a matchmaker for mail-order brides back in Massachusetts. Her butler, Higgins, did most of the legwork, but she taught him how she wanted it done. Higgins married after they moved to Seattle, and his stepson is married to Amaryllis. Is Amaryllis the second sister? Violet shook her head. No, I'll help you with that before we get home. I always paint miniatures of all of us for new people in the family. With 8 of us, it's difficult to keep up with who's who. She moved a little closer to him. Lily is the second sister. She was always a tomboy. She ended up marrying Daniel, who works as a banker for my father. Is she still a tomboy? He asked, his eyes twinkling. Actually she is. She's a mother now, too, but she still runs around in breeches as much as possible. Amaryllis is the third sister. She's the one who married Higgins's stepson. She's a librarian. Does she still work? He asked. She does. I never thought I'd find a man who would allow me to do it, though. Alex is one of a kind. Alex is her husband? Yes, sorry. Rose is married to Sean. Lily is married to Daniel, and Amaryllis is married to Alex. Daisy is the fourth sister, and she was always the quiet one. She's got the biggest heart you've ever seen, but she's shy. She didn't have any suitors and was sick of Mama pestering her to marry, so Aunt Harriet sent her to Montana to be a mail-order bride. Jonas laughed. I guess that showed her. Is she the one you told me your mother went with when she went to be a mail-order bride? Oh yes. Mama and Jasmine both went with her. Anyway, Daisy married Eli, and they live in Montana together. Jasmine went out to help Daisy while she was carrying her oldest. While she was there, she met Lee Fields. He had these rambunctious, prank-playing twin boys. She married him, much to Mama's distress. She didn't want 2 of her daughters to be in Montana. Violet grinned. Those boys are just like Jasmine was. She deserves to have kids like that. Jasmine played pranks on people? Jasmine was ridiculous. My sisters began to call her a demented nincompoop all the time. She grinned. She didn't play a lot of jokes on me, because I'm younger, but when the older girls were courting, it was just awful for them. She thought back to some of the things Jasmine had said to her sister's suitors, and she knew she would have been horrifically embarrassed. She sounds lovely. Oh, she is a lovely person now. Violet shook her head. Then there's Hyacinth. She always walked around in a dream world. I can't count the number of times I've seen her walk into walls. No one really knew her, if you know what I mean. We all loved her, but we didn't understand her. You do now? He asked. Oh, yes. She's a writer. She spent all her time wandering around that way, because she was thinking about what she was going to write next. She loves writing. She married Lawrence, who is also a writer. She's expecting her second baby now. And she's how old? He was having a hard time keeping them all straight. She's 22. She's the sister above me. We're all 18 months apart. So there's one younger than you? He asked. Yes, and I'm not certain she'll ever marry. Iris is at university right now. She's studying to be a doctor. She grinned as she thought of Iris. Her sister was willing to take on anything. Jonas looked at her with surprise. A doctor? But she'll change her mind and be a midwife soon, won't she? I really don't think she will. She's a bit determined. She gets really angry if any of her professors even suggest midwifery to her. She's determined to be a doctor, and that's that. Wow. I wish her luck. I wonder if anyone would ever go to a woman doctor. Violet shrugged. I don't know. I hope so for Iris's sake. Anyway, Iris is the youngest. He looked out the window and sighed with relief. They were at the hotel. He was worried he wouldn't be able to keep his hands off her the entire way. We're here. Chapter 9. Violet peered out the window at the hotel. She'd never stayed in a hotel, but she didn't want to admit that to Jonas. It's beautiful. The Waldorf? She'd never heard of it, but if that's where he wanted to stay, who was she to complain? They'd be alone finally, and that's what really mattered. He nodded. It just opened its doors 3 years ago. It's the place to stay in the city. He climbed down the steps after the door was opened for them. Turning back, he held his hand up for her. I haven't had the opportunity to stay here yet, but I've heard really good things about it. A young man in a strange hat walked up to Jonas. May I get your bags, sir? Jonas nodded to the coachman who helped the man with the bags while the two of them walked into the hotel. Violet looked around her with wide eyes. She'd grown up with luxury, and she thought she'd seen it all. The Waldorf surpassed anything she'd ever imagined. After a quick check-in, Jonas took the key they were handed and led her to the elevator. Violet was nervous, never having been in an elevator before, but Jonas looked perfectly at ease. 12th floor please, he requested. Once they reached their floor, he led her to their room. As soon as the door closed, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her. They jumped apart at the knock on the door, and Jonas had the bellboy put their suitcases down, tipping him discreetly. Thank you for your assistance. The bellboy nodded and closed the door behind him. As soon as he did, Jonas looked at Violet. No more interruptions. It's just us for 48 hours. I don't plan to leave even to get food. This hotel has a wonderful little thing called room service, and we're going to make the most of it. Violet looked at him, knowing he was the man she was going to spend the rest of her life with. The only man she would ever accept into her body. The man who would be the father of her children. All at once, she was overwhelmed by emotion. He'd chosen her out of all the women he'd ever met to be his bride. They weren't in Seattle any longer. He knew a wide variety of women, most of them more elegant than she was. She wanted to please him. She knew that in bed, they would please each other, but out of it, she needed to get to know him better. She was suddenly struck by how little she knew about this man. Dare she ask him questions? Jonas shrugged out of his jacket and carefully laid it across a small table. He sat down in a chair and removed his shoes and socks, his eyes never leaving her. His focus seemed to be entirely upon her and getting his clothes off. Violet looked toward the window. It's daylight. Shouldn't we wait? He grinned. Don't worry, it'll happen after dark too. He stood and unbuttoned his shirt, pulling it out of his slacks and laying it onto his jacket. When he stood barefoot and nude from the waist up, he slowly walked toward her. Aren't you feeling a bit overdressed? She blushed. Not particularly. He reached out and plucked the flower from her hair, holding it under his nose. You were aptly named after the most beautiful of all flowers. The rose is the most beautiful, she argued. She'd heard man after man say similar things to Rose when she was little. They all told her that the rose was the most beautiful flower. No, the violet. And you, my Violet, are the most beautiful woman I've ever met. He sat down onto the bed, and caught her hand, pulling her toward him to stand between his spread legs. There's no reason to be nervous. I'm not going to hurt you. Violet nodded slowly, more embarrassed than afraid. Why had she thought he would wait until after dark to consummate their union? He pulled her down to sit beside him on the bed, telling himself he needed to go slowly with her. He wanted to throw her clothes off and start making love to her, but she was too skittish for that. It was hard to believe this was the same woman who had sneaked into his bed naked the night before. Maybe he should give her a bit of wine again. No, he wanted her to remember the night, and their first experience loving each other. He cupped her face in his hands and lowered his lips to hers, the first kiss barely a brush of their lips against each other. His fingers wound into her hair, carefully removing the pins that kept her hair atop her head. Violet hated that he'd stopped kissing her and leaned forward to capture his lips with hers, putting everything he'd taught her into the kiss. Her tongue thrust into his mouth to mate with his, while her hand stroked his shoulders and back. At her response, his fingers went to the row of buttons down her back, carefully unbuttoning each one. He pushed the bodice of her dress off her shoulders until it pooled around her waist, his lips leaving hers to kiss a trail down her neck and across her shoulder. "Your skin is so soft." Violet liked his lips on her neck. She liked them too much. She felt as if her entire body was on fire with anticipation. She stood abruptly and pushed the skirt of her dress over her hips and turned to him so he could untie her corset for her. A smile played at the corner of Jonas's lips. Only Violet would go from nervous to ready to have her clothes off so quickly. How could he not love that about her? He untied her corset and pushed it down over her hips. Turning her to face him, she was wearing only her combination underwear. It was a lacy sleeveless chemise on the top and narrowed down to drawers on the bottom. He reached out and caught her nipple between his thumb and forefinger, toying with it through the thin fabric of her chemise. He leaned forward and caught her other nipple between his lips, suckling it through her undergarment. Violet let out a gasp, clasping his head between her hands and holding him steady. She didn't know if what he was doing was right, but after the talk Edna had with her earlier, she wasn't going to say anything, since he was bringing her pleasure, and according to Edna that was all that mattered at the moment. He pulled away and looked up at her, his brown eyes hooded with passion. "Do you like that?" She nodded. "I like it a lot. More than I should, I'm certain." "No, we're married. I want you to enjoy what we do in the bedroom or wherever else we happen to be doing it. You shouldn't allow me to do things to your body that you don't like. You should actively participate in everything, and let me know what you like and don't like." He stood, gathering her close to him. "I want you to enjoy my body, just as much as I'm going to enjoy yours." She tilted her head to one side and considered, "Does that mean if I want to take all your clothes off and look at you, I can?" She wasn't certain she'd want to, because that sounded terribly bold to her, but if she did, she'd like to be able to. "I'd like that a lot." His hands went to the waistband of his slacks. "I'll take them off right now if you want me to." "You would? Really?" She couldn't believe he was ready to strip for her right there and then. He raised an eyebrow at her before unbuttoning his slacks and pushing them to the floor. His drawers were next, and then he was naked in front of her. "Now what?" he asked. Violet's cheeks were flaming with embarrassment. "I didn't actually ask you to do it. I just wondered if you would." He chuckled. "I think I will." "I can see that. You haven't seen anything. You won't even look at me." She shook her head. "I've never seen a man naked before." Jonas sighed. "You know I'm going to be touching you everywhere, and you'll be touching me. Don't you think you should look?" "No. I'm good." He laughed. "I hope you know that I'm going to look." He pressed a quick kiss to her lips. "I'm going to take everything off you, and then I'm going to look until I can't stand it any longer. Then I'll touch you all over." She shivered. "That would be all right." He grinned, nipping her ear. "It had better be all right, wife." "Wife. I like the sound of that." "I do too." He pushed the straps of her chemise down over her shoulders and pushed the whole garment to the floor so she could step out of it. Her face was flaming as she watched his, hoping he wouldn't find her lacking. She couldn't make herself look at him below his waist, afraid of what she'd see. How could she not have realized how embarrassing this first time would be? He scooped her into his arms and laid her gently onto the bed, following her down. His lips toyed with hers while his hands traveled over her body, paying special attention to her breasts. When she'd relaxed finally, his hand settled between her thighs and toyed with her moist folds. She felt something building inside her. The tingling was spreading and she was almost in a panic from not being certain what to do. Her head thrashed back and forth on the pillow as she fought to get control of herself. When he finally covered her and slipped inside her, she felt no pain, only pleasure. How she'd ever worried about this experience was beyond her. His gentleness made her feel like she was cherished. As they laid together after with their limbs entangled, she stroked his chest. "I might even be able to look at you next time." He smiled, kissing her forehead. "I hope so." "I'm hungry," Violet whispered to Jonas. They'd both fallen asleep, and it was dark out. You are? Do you want to order room service? He asked. She shook her head. Let's just go somewhere. Do you mind? Of course not. He jumped out of bed and pulled his clothes on, turning to catch her watching him. Hey. I thought you couldn't look. She blushed, but refused to apologize. I've felt every inch of you. Why can't I see it too? It? You were looking at it specifically? She threw a pillow at him, hitting him in the head with it. I was not looking at it. Behave yourself. She waited until his back was turned to hurry out of bed and pull her clothes on. When she was dressed, she turned to find him watching her. She sighed. I'm going to have to get used to being intimate with you. Yes, you are. I like you too much to stop. He walked around the bed and buttoned the back of her dress for her, kissing the nape of her neck. Why don't you deal with your hair? Then we'll go down to eat. Violet didn't even want to think about what her hair could look like. Not only had she slept without braiding it, but he'd been playing with it before she'd fallen asleep. She got her bag and hurried into the bathroom to set her hair to rights. 5 minutes later, she walked out and smiled. I'm ready. He looked up from where he was reading a book, startled. My sister would have taken an hour. You're really ready? She laughed. My sister, Rose, would have taken an hour too, and yes, I'm really ready. He carefully marked his page before standing and walking to her. Let's go find you some food then. They took the elevator to the first floor, and once they got there, he walked to the concierge. We need to find a restaurant where we can eat without reservations, Jonas told the man. Jonas? Is that really you? A pretty young blonde was standing beside the concierge desk looking at Jonas as if he were the person she'd been looking for. Jonas turned and looked at the woman. His face tightened, but Violet didn't think the woman noticed. Eunice. Eunice threw herself at Jonas, hugging him tightly. Oh, it's so good to see you. I heard you were in town for the execution. I'm so sorry John betrayed you. Jonas was annoyed by the woman. She had been John's fiancée before the murders, and he'd never really liked her. Eunice, this is my wife, Violet. Eunice turned to Violet and gripped her hand. It's so nice to meet you. I'm sorry it's under such terrible circumstances. Violet's eyes met Eunice's. I'm on my honeymoon. That doesn't feel like a terrible circumstance to me. Eunice's eyes narrowed before she turned back to Jonas. I'm so glad you're here. We've all missed you. I'm just here getting the house ready to sell. There's no point in keeping it any longer. Jonas kept his voice even, hoping that she would leave them soon. He didn't want to spend any longer with the girl than he absolutely had to. Would you let me buy you dinner? Eunice asked sweetly. I almost feel like it's my fault you lost your sister, because I was the one engaged to him at the time. Violet could see that Jonas wanted to say no and was searching for the right words to do so. She stepped forward and said in her most simpering voice. Jonas, you promised we could spend the evening just the two of us. Please tell me you're not going to let her come with us. Eunice glared at Violet. Well, if you won't let me buy your dinner, at least come out to the coach with me. I still have Emily Grace's necklace. I even brought it with me tonight, because I was hoping I'd run into you. I'd heard you were in the city. Jonas's eyes met Violet's, and she gave a slight nod. All right, we'll go with you. On their way out the front door of the hotel, Violet couldn't help but notice a muscular man with dark hair and sad eyes. She stopped. Are you all right, sir? He smiled faintly. I'm fine. I'm just here taking care of some business, and I miss my family. I'm ready to go home. His voice held a southern accent, but Violet couldn't quite place it. Where's home? Texas, ma'am. I'm Walton Dalton. And you are? Violet Sullivan. Smith. I wonder how long it will take me to remember I'm married when I introduce myself. She was embarrassed to have used her maiden name, but she was certain other women had done the same thing when they'd first married. Jonas turned to her. I thought you were hungry. It was nice meeting you, Mr. Dalton. Nice meeting you as well, Mrs. Smith. Violet hurried after Jonas. Eunice had walked a little ways down the street, stopping at a coach and talking to the driver. Once they were close, she spun from the coach, a small gun in her hand. She motioned with the gun. Into the alley, both of you. Jonas put his hand on Violet's arm, suddenly fearful. Not for himself, but for Violet. He wouldn't be able to live with himself if anything happened to her. Eunice, put the gun down. You don't want to hurt anyone. Oh, but I do. In the alley. Her voice was no longer that of a sweet young lady, but now she sounded angry and hardened. You wouldn't give any money to John to help him out of his bind, and he had to kill people. And then you went and watched him executed as if you were happy he died. He was your friend. He was my sister's murderer. I helped John out of bind after bind. Do you have any idea how much money I gave him over the years for his gambling habit? Jonas tried his best to stay between Violet and the gun as he moved toward the alley as Eunice insisted he do. Yes, I do as a matter of fact. You see, John never had a gambling problem. I did. He was just trying to pay off my debts. Why couldn't you have let your brother-in-law loan us just a bit more money? We needed it a lot more than your family ever did. Was it your idea to steal the jewelry then? Jonas asked, keeping his voice calm and even. He wanted to scream at the woman, but he'd never do anything to risk Violet. Eunice laughed. Of course, it was. John never would have been able to plan that on his own. She shook her head. He wasn't the brightest man, but he certainly did love me. No one will ever love me that way again. I think you need to understand the pain of losing the person you love more than all others. She raised her gun and pointed it straight at Violet's chest. Violet. What about our dinner plans? A voice called from the street. Eunice jerked the gun away from Violet for just a moment as the voice yelled, and Jonas took the opportunity to knock the gun out of Eunice's hand. He kicked it far into the alley, before taking her wrist in his hand. Thank you, he called to the man who had yelled for Violet. You're very welcome, Mr. Smith. Do you want me to run and fetch a police officer for you? Yes, please. As the man ran off, Jonas turned to Violet. Who was that man anyway? His name is Walton Dalton. Isn't that just a terrible name? He looked sad, so I talked to him in the hotel. Stop acting like I'm not even here. Eunice cried. I hate you both. The police officer walked over then and snapped handcuffs on Eunice's wrists. He looked at Jonas. Are you willing to make a statement? Jonas nodded. I am. Can I do it in the morning? It's my wedding night, and my bride is hungry. By all means. Come by the station first thing tomorrow. He held on to Eunice's cuffs as he led her away. Violet stepped into Jonas's arms, all but sobbing. Now that the danger was over, she was ready to fall apart. Thank you for saving me. Jonas sighed, kissing the top of her head. It was my pleasure. The man who had helped them stepped forward. Thank you for your help again, Mr. Dalton. Jonas said. Happy to do it. I hope if my wife is ever in a bad spot, someone will help her as well. Is your wife back in Texas, Mr. Dalton? Violet asked. She is. I'll be on a train back to Gwen and the children first thing in the morning. Give her my best. Violet may have never met the other woman, but based on the type of man she could see Walton Dalton was, she knew she was a good woman. I will. It was nice meeting you, Mrs. Smith. Mr. Smith. He tipped his cowboy hat and walked away. Jonas let out a sigh of relief. So glad that's over. You still hungry? Violet nodded. I am. Let's get some food. Chapter 10. As soon as they'd had breakfast in their room the following morning, Jonas stood. We need to go to the police station and tell them what happened. The look on his face was angry, and Violet was worried about him. Violet nodded. She was still extremely shaken, but she knew that time would help her with that. It was good to have Jonas beside her. She wasn't certain how she would feel otherwise. Jonas had said very little to her since the incident the night before. She knew in her heart that he couldn't be angry with her, but she couldn't stop worrying about it. She wanted to ask him if he was angry, but she knew it would do no good. He was too lost in emotion over the run-in with Eunice. She dressed slowly, wanting to put off the visit to the police station for as long as possible. She hoped they wouldn't have to actually see or talk to Eunice. She wasn't certain she could bear that. No one had ever pulled a gun on her before, and every time she closed her eyes she could still see the gun pointing at her. She was very thankful to know the other woman was in jail. On the short walk to the police station, Jonas gripped her hand tightly. "Does it bother you knowing she was manipulating John?" Violet asked. She knew the question would sound silly, but she needed to get him talking about it. She was worried he'd do something crazy. Jonas nodded. "More than anything. I feel like she's the one who should have been put to death, not him." He sighed. "If you hadn't been with me last night, I don't know that I could have prevented myself from killing her." He was both thankful she'd been there and resentful. He wanted the woman dead with everything inside him. Did they even put women to death for violent crimes? He didn't know, but if any woman had ever needed killing, it was Eunice. She rested her head against his shoulder. "I hope we don't have to see her today." She wasn't certain if she could look at a woman who wanted her dead without getting angry. She would prefer to keep her emotions under control while she was supposed to be spending a few days alone with her new husband. "I want to see her. There are so many things I want to say to her. I want to list all the lives she's ruined. I want to tell her what a manipulative, hateful beast she is. I want her to know that she's the one who killed John and my sister and brother-in-law. I want her to know how very much I hate her." He knew his attitude wasn't Christian, but at that moment he didn't care. "You can't let it consume you." Violet knew that compared to the small part she knew of his life, hers had been all but perfect. How could she possibly understand what he was going through or know the right words to say? "Let's concentrate on the family we're building." He sighed. "I've got to talk to her. I never got to talk to John before he was executed, because I never tried. I've got to tell her how I feel about everything." He had been so consumed with revenge he hadn't been willing to listen to anything his former friend may have had to say. "Do you think that will help you?" She didn't want him to put himself through facing the evil woman if it would do nothing to help him move on with his life, but if it would make him get to the point that he could have a happy marriage with her, then it would all be worth it. "I don't know. I hope so." How could he express what he thought would happen? He just didn't know. He'd never had to deal with this type of situation before. When they got to the police station, they stepped inside. Violet was immediately taken aback by the hustle and bustle. For a moment, she wasn't certain anyone would even notice them standing there. "May I help you?" An older gentleman in a suit with salt and pepper hair and huge blue eyes stepped up to them. He obviously worked for the police station in some capacity. Jonas nodded. "We're here to make a statement. Someone tried to kill us last night." He knew Eunice had really just been targeting Violet, but the more he thought about that, the angrier he got. Violet was innocent through everything, and she'd almost been murdered just because he'd married her. What kind of person would kill a stranger for revenge? "Why didn't you say anything last night?" The man frowned, obviously thinking they had waited to report what had happened. "2 reasons. The woman was in custody before we left, and it was our wedding night." Jonas wrapped his arm around Violet's shoulders, trying to protect her from the entire situation. The man nodded. "Both very good reasons." He held his hand out. "I'm Detective Sorensen. Jonas Smith and my wife, Violet." Jonas realized as he said the word that he loved calling her his wife. She really was the other half of him. "It's good to meet you. Who tried to kill you?" Detective Sorensen started to walk away but then called back over his shoulder, "Follow me." He made it very clear that he was willing to take their statement, but they needed to hurry and do it on his timetable. Jonas grabbed Violet's hand and wove his way through the station, keeping her with him. The detective led them to a small room in the back. "Sit." Tell me what happened. He sat on one side of a small table and indicated the chairs at the other side. He took a notebook and a pencil from the table and opened it to a clean page. Jonas related the story of his brother-in-law and sister's murders to give the other man background on what had occurred the night before. John Fedkenhauer. He got the chair this week, didn't he? The case had been well publicized through the entire state. Everyone knew there was an execution scheduled. Yes, sir. I was there to witness it. John was an old college friend of mine before he killed my family. Jonas hated admitting that he was the one to introduce John to his future victims. Violet squeezed Jonas's hand under the table, hoping to help him through the interview. All right, and this Eunice woman? Did you know her before? Detective Sorensen asked. Jonas nodded. I've known her for a couple of years. Ever since she and John started getting serious. It was shortly after I met her that his gambling problem started. At first I was willing to help, but it got more and more frequent. I finally told him I'd never loan him another dime just before I left to go to Seattle and open a new art gallery. My family was supposed to travel out and join me a month later. It was while I was gone that he killed my family. Jonas carefully kept his voice even. He wanted to rant and rave about the injustice that had been done. He wanted to throw things and act like a child. It wouldn't help though, and this man had done nothing wrong. I'm really sorry for your loss. The detective's words sounded sincere, even though Violet was certain they were uttered more frequently than any of them cared to admit. Thank you, Jonas said, nodding. I met my wife in Seattle, and we were married yesterday. Last night was the first time I'd seen Eunice since I went to Seattle the first time. He left out the part about how he'd met Violet, because he was certain the other man only wanted pertinent details. How much do you think she had to do with your family's murders? Jonas thought about that for a moment. I know she was behind them, because she orchestrated them. It wouldn't surprise me at all to find out she'd pulled the trigger herself, though. Sounds like a classy lady. I've never been overly fond of her, Jonas admitted. From the first time he'd met Eunice, she'd carefully made it clear to him that she would choose him, and his wealth, over John any day. Jonas didn't find that appealing in a woman. The detective jotted down what Jonas had told him. How long will you be in town this time, Mr. Smith? My wife has a showing of her art at my gallery here in New York in 2 months. We'll leave shortly after that to go home to Seattle. His eyes met Violet's, and he smiled slightly. Good, that should give us enough time to try and convict her. Detective Sorensen got to his feet and extended his hand to shake Jonas's. Thank you for taking the time to come in and give a statement. It will make it a lot easier for us to prosecute her. Jonas stood as well. I know this is probably not something you usually do, but would it be all right if I talked to her? Just for a minute or two? I need to get some things off my chest. He held his breath as he waited for an answer. He knew it was against protocol, but at that moment, he needed the answer to be in the affirmative. The detective studied him for a moment before nodding. I don't want you to have any physical contact with her, but you can say anything you want. If I were in your shoes, I'd want to wring the little tramp's neck. He looked at Violet. You going with him? Violet shook her head. No, she's part of his old life. I'm his future. We'll keep the two parts separate. Unless you need me there, Jonas. She would gladly be beside him for the discussion if she needed to be, but she didn't want anything about her to ever remind him of this mess. Jonas looked down at her. No, but thank you. Go ahead and wait at the front where I met you, Mrs. Smith. I'll have your husband back to you in a few minutes. Violet waited at the front, wishing she'd brought a sketchpad. There were interesting faces all around her. She carried her sketchpad everywhere she went, but she'd forgotten it today. Why? After a minute or two, she saw a man standing near her with a sheaf of paper and pencils. May I have a couple of sheets? And borrow a pencil? She asked. The man looked at her for a moment as if wondering who she was, but then he just shrugged. Sure, lady. Don't make no difference to me, thank you. She took the papers he handed her and the pencil and immediately started sketching. She did quick drawings of as many faces as she could, thrilled to have the opportunity to do so. The policemen were the most interesting to her. They all seemed to be tired. There were a couple of younger officers that seemed more excited than anything, but Violet knew their faces would change with time and experience. It was over 30 minutes later when Jonas walked to the front of the station, looking tired. "Are you all right?" she asked. She'd expected him long before that. He nodded. "I'm fine. I told her what I think of her. I've never in my life met such a singularly selfish person." Eunice had tried again to blame him for all of her actions. Never once had she been willing to admit that her gambling and selfishness had been at the heart of everything. He was done though. He'd said his piece, and he was ready to move on. Violet reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I'm glad it's over. Do you feel better?" "Yes, I really do. I think it was smart to talk to her. It's almost like I can close a door on all of this now, and move on." They left the station and stepped out onto the sidewalk. He took her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing it softly. "Thank you for being beside me through this. It made it a lot easier for me." Since he was 20 years old, he'd had no one to lean on. Now he did. He'd never dreamed that he would lean so heavily on his wife. "I was happy to help." As they walked back toward the hotel, she sighed. "I'm glad that's over. I was really nervous about going to the police station." If it hadn't been so important to him, she didn't know if she could have made herself go. They walked on in silence for a while, passing by store after store along the way. "There are so many things to see and do here. I almost feel bad for as much time as I've spent painting. Will we ever come back?" As dirty as New York was, she found herself falling in love with the big city. She knew she'd want to visit again and see all the things she hadn't wanted to see. "I'll still own my gallery here. I have a feeling we'll be coming back at least once every year or so. Will you mind traveling that much?" He hated the idea of tearing her away from her family so often. She shook her head. "No, but I think my sister, Rose, will be terribly jealous. She wants to come here and shop for dresses. She'd have to get Rose's measurements before the next visit so she could have a dress made for her eldest sister. This is the place to do it." He sighed. "After our parents died, I had to be strong for Emily Grace. She was only 16 and I was 20, so it was my responsibility to help her." "How did they die?" He'd talked so little about his family other than his sister and the murders. "They were lost at sea. Father inherited some land in England, and he went over to sell it. They drowned on the way back. They thought about taking Emily Grace with them, but she was in school. Since I was living at home while going to the university here, I just watched over her. She had a house full of servants and a big brother to take care of her. I became more of a father figure to her than anything else after that." "Do you miss them? Mother and father?" he asked. She nodded. "I can't imagine life without mine." "I do. Not as much as I did at first. The grief goes, and other things in your life overtake it. I had to run the family business and take care of my sister all while going to school. I resented that at times." "Family business?" she asked. "You really don't know anything about me, do you?" Why had she married him when she didn't know anything about him? She knew he was wealthy, but he didn't think she had any idea of the sheer magnitude of the wealth she'd married into. She shrugged. "I know you're a kind man who takes your responsibilities seriously. I know you have a great deal of love in your heart for those who are worthy of it. I know you are a good businessman." She grinned at him impishly. "I know you're a good kisser, and you make me feel things I never thought I'd feel." The morning had been extremely intense, and she hoped a little humor would make them both feel better. Besides, she really did like his kisses. She'd proven that more than once or twice. "Oh really? Like what?" She blushed. "You're not supposed to ask me that." She looked around, wondering if anyone was listening to their discussion. "Why not? Are you my wife or not?" He loved watching her blush. There was very little in life he enjoyed more than being with his pretty young wife. You're just not. I'll show you later though. She wiggled her eyebrows at him to express her meaning, and he let out a laugh. That's what I love about you, Violet. Even when I think that I'm never going to be able to smile again, you say something that makes me laugh through the pain. I need that. She really was the perfect woman for him, and he'd be thanking God for her every day for the rest of his life. She looked at him and sighed. I love everything about you. I've never met a man who I was so drawn to. I never thought I would. She suddenly realized she had it all. She had a man she loved, an adorable little boy, and a career she'd been working towards since she was a small child. He smiled. I love everything about you, too. I'm so happy that I finally have the right to be alone with you and talk to you about my feelings. Our relationship had a rocky start with Nathan, and the murders, and your painting, and Edna, but we're going to have the best marriage you can possibly imagine. She frowned. Edna? What's wrong with Edna? Didn't he adore Edna the same way she did? She was going to have to do some fast talking to make certain the older woman always had a home with them if he didn't care for her friend like she did. Jonas squeezed her hand. I can't believe you even have to ask. Epilogue. Iris sat down at her kitchen table and rubbed her neck. She needed to write a letter home before her mother came to Texas to check on her, but she needed sleep just as much. She could write a short one this week and promise a longer one next. Yes, that's what she'd do. No one needed Mary Sullivan to descend on Nowhere, Texas, and set the whole place on its ear. Dear Mother, thank you for the letter. It's always so nice to receive news from home. I love it here in Texas. Of course, summer is approaching, and I'm not sure if that's going to change or not. I've heard the heat is stifling. I'm willing to brave it as long as I have my patience and Edna Petunia beside me though. I like it here in Nowhere. It's hard dealing with some of the archaic attitudes people have about women in medicine, but I'm learning to cope. Why just today a widower brought his daughter into me with a broken arm. He was angry to find out that Dr. Sullivan was a woman. He said women doctors are menaces, and they know nothing about what they're doing. He demanded to see the real doctor. I told him it was me, or make a 5-hour drive with his daughter in pain. He chose me. Francis Harvey may be a bigoted idiot, but he does love his children. He has girls ages 10, 8, and 6. His poor wife died in childbirth with the 6-year-old. I wanted to tell him I probably could have helped his wife, but I didn't know how. I certainly hope I won't be seeing much of him, but his attitude is similar to most of the men around here. For some reason, though, he just made me angrier than most. Edna Petunia is settling in well here. I think she loves the sheer number of cowboys that ride through town. It was a brilliant idea for her to come along as my nurse and companion. You were definitely right about this not being a place a woman would want to live alone. I kind of think she has her eye on an old cowboy who rides into town every so often to get more whiskey to make a cough tonic. You know, even after all these years of knowing me, that woman still totes that flask around and drinks out of it constantly? What is wrong with her? I wish I could convince her that drinking all the time was bad for her health, but at her age, she thinks she can get away with anything. She's apparently right, too. How is the family? Is Violet's pregnancy going well this time? Her first pregnancy was a little scary, but I'm so glad Heather is doing well. I'm a little nervous that I can't be there for her this time, but at least she has doctors that we all trust taking good care of her. I wish everyone could come here and see Texas, but I know that's not going to happen anytime soon. I'll try to come home for Christmas as you suggested in your last letter, but I do need to make certain my patients will be taken care of. It's certainly good incentive to know that both Daisy and Jasmine will be there with their families this year. I don't think we've all been together since Violet's art show back in 1896. It's 1904. It's time. There's a good midwife in town, so I don't have to be worried about the pregnant women while I'm gone. It's late, and I have to be at work early as usual. I'm going to close here. Let me know how things are at home. How are Papa's hands? Is the cream I made him for his arthritis helping? I miss you all terribly. I'll be home soon and all of your flowers will be back in your garden where they belong. I love you, Mama. Sincerely, Iris Sullivan, MD. PS. I know you know who I am, but I worked so hard for those letters after my name, I just have to include them. Folding the letter, Iris set it aside. She stood up and started to blow out the candle when she heard loud giggling from outside. Opening the door, she saw Edna Petunia standing with her cowboy, letting him touch her in places that were completely inappropriate. Iris shook her head. She didn't know whether to scold Edna Petunia as if she were a teenager or let her do what she wanted to do. It wasn't as if she had marriage prospects. She closed the door softly, not wanting to disturb them. It wasn't her place to teach morality to a woman more than twice her age. She padded through the small house in her bare feet and nightgown and into her bedroom. Edna Petunia would come in when she was ready to come in. The woman just did what she wanted to do anyway. It didn't reflect on Iris as a doctor, and certainly didn't reflect on her own work. Iris refused to worry about it as she turned down the wick in her lantern and climbed between the covers. Tomorrow would be a busy day. She was the only doctor for a 50-mile radius, and everyone came to her. She yawned and puffed up her pillow. As she was drifting off to sleep, she heard another loud giggle. She couldn't help but smile as she closed her eyes. No matter how hard life was, Edna Petunia always had the ability to make her smile.